A man was laughed at by an entire room when a billionaire handed him a rusted piece of junk at a charity gala. But the moment he looked at that car, he knew he was holding something the entire world had been searching for over 50 years. If you want to know what happens when an ordinary man, a single father, turns public humiliation in front of 200 billionaires into the most stunning automotive discovery in decades, stay until the end of this story. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Ethan Mercer walked into the Hargrove Grand Hotel, he already knew he didn't belong there. It wasn't an insecurity. It was just a fact. The same way it's a fact that a work boot doesn't belong on a marble floor. Not because there's anything wrong with the boot, but because the boot was built for something real, and marble floors exist mostly to remind people that they're walking on something expensive. Ethan had driven 40 minutes in his 2009 Ford pickup, found the farthest parking spot from the valet stand so nobody would see the truck, and spent 6 minutes in the cab trying to remember how to tie a Windsor knot before giving up and switching to a half Windsor. The tie was his late wife's father's. It was burgundy with thin gold stripes and slightly too short, and he'd worn it exactly twice before. Once to his wedding, once to her funeral. He wasn't sure why he'd chosen it tonight. He just had. The invitation had come through Carl Briggs, who ran the Millbrook Automotive Preservation Society, and had somehow convinced Ethan to represent the chapter at the Langford Foundation's annual charity gala. "It's good visibility," Carl had said over the phone, which was exactly the kind of thing people said when they wanted you to do something you didn't want to do. Ethan had almost said no 4 separate times during that conversation. He'd said yes because his daughter Sophie had overheard the call and told him he should go, that he never went anywhere anymore, which was true, and which landed differently coming from a 9-year-old than it would have from anyone else. So he went. The ballroom of the Hargrove Grand seated roughly 400 people, and on the night of the Langford Foundation Gala, it held somewhere between 250 and 300, which still felt like an impossible number of people wearing that much money on their bodies. Ethan estimated he was probably the only person in the room whose jacket had been purchased at a department store during a sale. He stood near the edge of the appetizer table for the first 40 minutes and ate more shrimp than he intended to because it gave his hands something to do. He recognized a few faces from automotive circles, collectors, dealers, a restoration consultant he'd crossed paths with years ago at a concours event in Virginia. Most people were finance, real estate, the particular variety of wealthy that didn't attach itself to any single industry but moved between them like water. They talked about markets and foundations and philanthropic portfolios in the same tone that Ethan used to talk about ignition timing and compression ratios, automatically, fluently, without having to think about it. He was on his second glass of water when he first saw Victoria Langford. She entered from the side corridor near the stage, surrounded by 3 people who moved in formation around her the way a wake moves around a boat, not deliberately, just as a natural consequence of her forward motion. She was 30 years old and looked like someone who had never in her life needed to explain herself to anyone, which Ethan would later understand was both accurate and more complicated than it appeared. She wore a dark green dress that probably cost more than his truck, and moved through the room with the particular confidence of someone who knows that every space they enter has been prepared for them in advance. He noticed her the way you notice a change in weather, not because he was watching for it, but because the atmosphere shifted. He went back to his water. He was not there to notice anyone. He was there because Sophie had told him he should go somewhere, and this was somewhere. The dinner proceeded the way these things do, courses arriving at timed intervals, conversation building and falling across the tables. The soft orchestral undercurrent that existed to fill silence and cost someone a great deal of money. Ethan sat at table 11 with Carl and a pair of collectors from Connecticut who spent most of dinner arguing amiably about whether a particular 1955 Mercedes-Benz restoration they'd both seen at auction had been authentic or a very good fake. Ethan had opinions about this, but kept most of them to himself. He ate the salmon, which was good, and the risotto, which was fine, and declined the wine a second time when the server offered it. Victoria Langford gave a speech after dessert. It was a competent speech, professional, polished, the kind of thing that had been reviewed by at least 3 people before she delivered it. She talked about the Foundation's work in arts education and community restoration programs, and she said the right things in the right order, and the room applauded at the correct moments. Ethan noticed she didn't look at her notes once. He noticed she also didn't look particularly moved by any of it, not in the way that people sometimes are when they're saying something they actually mean. It wasn't that she seemed dishonest. It was more that she seemed very far away from the room she was standing in, as if a large part of her was somewhere else doing something else, while this version of her stood at the podium and said the right words. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself for about 2 years after Sarah died. Then the auction began, and things changed. The Langford Foundation Gala had a signature moment each year, a finale donation, something theatrical, designed to be remembered and talked about. The previous year, according to Carl, had involved a private concert. The year before that, a commissioned painting. This year, Victoria Langford had something different in mind. She returned to the podium after the last lot closed and smiled at the room with the easy warmth of someone who knew exactly what expression to put on and when. "Before we close tonight," she said, "I'd like to make one final contribution to the spirit of giving, a gift for one very lucky guest." She paused, and the room leaned slightly forward in the way rooms do. "Some of you may know that my late grandfather was a collector. Among the things he left behind when he passed were a number of vehicles, most of them beautiful, most of them valuable, most of them already spoken for." Another pause. "And then there was one that was none of those things." Light laughter from the room. "My estate manager has been asking me for 3 years what to do with it. My accountant calls it a liability. My restoration consultant," she glanced towards someone at a nearby table, "told me, quote, 'Victoria, that thing is not a car anymore. It's a philosophical problem.'" More laughter, louder now. "So tonight, in the spirit of generosity," she held up a set of old keys attached to a worn leather fob, "I'd like to give it away." She looked out across the room with a grin that was genuinely charming, and Ethan would give her that much. She was good at this. "The Langford Foundation will be presenting these keys to one of our guests tonight, a representative from the Millbrook Automotive Preservation Society." She glanced at a card in her other hand. "Mr. Ethan Mercer." The spotlight found him before he'd processed his name. Ethan set down his water glass. Carl was already nudging his elbow with the enthusiasm of a man who thought this was a great opportunity. Go on," he whispered. Around the table, the Connecticut collectors were smiling. The room was applauding, not the full-throated applause of something meaningful, but the amused, expectant applause of an audience that had been primed for a punchline and knew it was coming. He stood. He walked to the front of the room because there was nothing else to do. Victoria Langford was taller in person than she looked from across a ballroom. She extended the keys toward him with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem generous, bright enough to keep the joke alive. "Mr. Mercer," she said into the microphone, loud enough for the whole room, "on behalf of the Langford Foundation, I'd like to present you with a one-of-a-kind automobile." She let the pause breathe. "Well, it was an automobile, at some point." She glanced at the room. "Consider it a tip." The laughter was immediate and full, the genuine kind, the kind that a room produces when something has landed exactly right. 260 people, or however many were in that room, finding their moment of shared amusement at the expense of the man standing at the front with his department store jacket and his dead father-in-law's tie. Ethan took the keys. He looked at them in his palm. Old keys. 3 of them on the leather fob, the kind of keys that hadn't been manufactured since the 1960s. He looked at them for 3 seconds, maybe 4, while the room finished its laugh. He did not smile. He did not perform embarrassment or gratitude or good-natured amusement. He just looked at the keys the way a man looks at something he needs to think about. Then he looked up at Victoria Langford and said, quietly enough that only she heard it, "Where is it?" She blinked. It was a small blink, barely visible, the kind of reaction that only happened when something caught a person genuinely off guard. "I'm sorry?" "The car," Ethan said. "Where's it stored?" Something shifted in her expression. A micro-adjustment, the social version of recalibrating. She was accustomed to being the person who set the terms of a conversation, and something about the way he'd asked the question had briefly taken that from her. "Our estate property in Westfield," she said, after a half-second. "About 40 miles north." "I'll need access Monday morning," Ethan said. She stared at him. The room, which had mostly moved back toward its own conversations, didn't hear any of this. The microphone had drifted away. It was just the two of them in a bubble of 3 feet, and Ethan held her gaze with the same steady patience he used when he was explaining to a client why a job was going to cost more than they'd expected. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just certain. "I'll have my assistant arrange it," Victoria said, and her voice had a quality to it now that Ethan couldn't quite name. He nodded once. "Thank you for the keys, Miss Langford." He walked back to his table. Carl looked at him with wide eyes and mouthed something. The Connecticut collectors were murmuring to each other. Ethan sat down, picked up his water glass, and drank. The remainder of the evening passed without incident. He got home at 11:40. Mrs. Papadopoulos from next door had stayed with Sophie, as she did on the rare occasions Ethan went anywhere in the evening, and she gave him a look in the doorway that communicated without words that she thought he should go out more often, and also that she expected to be updated on whatever the occasion had been. He thanked her, locked the door, and looked in on Sophie, who was asleep in the particular total way that children sleep, completely absent from consciousness, her dark hair spread across the pillow. He stood in her doorway for a minute. Then he went to his kitchen table, laid the keys on the surface in front of him, and sat down. They were old keys, British-made from the shape of them. The bow had that particular elongated oval that certain British manufacturers had used through the 1950s. The leather fob was hand-stitched, which told him something. The stitching pattern told him something else. The wear pattern on the 2 door keys versus the ignition key told him that whoever had owned this car had been right-handed, had always used the same key to unlock the driver's door, and had treated the vehicle with the unconscious daily familiarity of something they loved and used constantly. He sat with the keys for a long time. Victoria Langford had called it a rusted wreck. Her restoration consultant had called it a philosophical problem. Her estate manager had been trying to dispose of it for 3 years. Ethan had been in this business long enough, both in it and around the edges of it, and in the deep archival corners of it where most people never looked, to know that the things everyone agreed were worthless were sometimes the most dangerous things to dismiss. Not always. Usually, they were just worthless. But sometimes. He thought about the stitching on the fob. He thought about the particular length of those keys. He went to bed at 1:15 and did not sleep well. Monday morning, he was at the Westfield estate property by 7:30, 40 minutes before the estate manager arrived. He sat in his truck in the driveway and drank coffee from a thermos and watched the light change over the property's wrought iron gate. It was a working estate, not someone's primary residence, but a maintained property, the kind of place that held overflow from a larger life. Several outbuildings were visible from the gate. One of them, the largest, would be the vehicle storage. The estate manager was a man named Gerald, 60-something, careful and professional in the way that people become when they've spent decades managing other people's valuable things. He shook Ethan's hand with measured politeness and asked if he'd be needing any equipment. "A good flashlight," Ethan said. "If you have one." Gerald had one. He led Ethan through the main gate and across the property to the largest outbuilding, a converted carriage house with climate-controlled storage bays along one side and what appeared to be standard storage along the other. The climate-controlled section held 3 vehicles under custom covers. Ethan clocked them without lifting the covers, reading the shapes. A pre-war touring car, something Italian from the 1960s, and what might have been an early Porsche, all of them properly stored, properly maintained, the work of someone who understood value. "The other one's in the back," Gerald said, with a tone that communicated he felt it contaminated the space. The back section of the carriage house was ordinary storage, garden equipment, outdoor furniture stacked and covered, cardboard boxes of the kind that accumulate when an estate has been in a family for generations. And in the far corner, half obscured by a canvas tarp that had been thrown over it without care, was the car, or what was left of it. Ethan stood 10 feet away and looked at it for a long moment before he moved any closer. Even from this distance, under the bad lighting and the thrown tarp, and the general disorder of a space that nobody had paid attention to in years, the silhouette was wrong. Not wrong in the way that a bad car was wrong. Wrong in the way that something unexpected is wrong. The shape didn't match the category it had been filed under. The tarp was sized for something ordinary. Whatever was underneath it was not sized like something ordinary. He walked forward and crouched at the rear of the vehicle, lifting the edge of the tarp. The rust was genuine and extensive. Decades of it, the kind that goes through layers and creates its own geography. The chrome that would have covered the lower bodywork was gone in places, pitted and darkened in others. The rear window had been broken at some point and never replaced, and there were signs of water intrusion along the sill. The tires, what remained of them, had perished completely. The rubber cracked and collapsed. There was no engine. The hood was ajar and the engine bay was empty, the absence made more striking by the scale of the bay itself. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Gerald stood near the door, watching with the polite detachment of a man who did not understand what he was watching. Ethan moved to the front of the car and lifted the tarp further and then stood back and looked at the hood line. The hood line of a car is like the jaw of a face. It defines the character of the whole thing in a way that's hard to articulate, but immediately recognizable once you know how to look. This hood line was long and slightly tapered toward the front, with a very specific crease along the leading edge that Ethan made himself slow down. He made himself not go where his mind was already pulling him. He'd been wrong before, not often, but enough times to know that certainty before investigation was how people made expensive mistakes. He took the flashlight from Gerald and crouched at the passenger side door. The metalwork on the lower panel, under the rust, under the grime, and the decades of accumulated indifference, he pressed his thumb against a section of bodywork near the rocker panel and felt the quality of what was underneath. Not the rust. The metal below the rust. Body panels on most cars had a particular feel when you pressed them. A slight flex. A response that told you about their gauge and their construction. This panel did not flex. It was formed and finished with a precision that you simply did not find in volume production. "Is there better lighting?" Ethan said. Gerald found a work lamp on a long cord. Ethan spent 40 minutes on his back under the car, which was raised slightly on the remains of jack stands that must have been placed there years ago and never removed. He used the flashlight in combination with the work lamp and looked at the undercarriage with the systematic patience that the work had always required, moving from front to back, from center to edge, not hurrying, not letting his conclusions get ahead of his evidence. The frame construction was hand-fabricated. He was certain of that within the first 10 minutes. You could see the weld work, and weld work was a signature as individual as handwriting. And this was weld work that belonged to someone with extraordinary skill and a specific methodology that Ethan had only ever seen documented in two places: a restoration manual published in limited edition in 1987 that he owned a copy of, and a set of photographs he had studied at an archive in the UK in 2009, before Sarah got sick, when he still traveled for the work. He came out from under the car and sat on the concrete floor and stared at the wheel well for a moment. "Mr. Mercer?" Gerald said. He'd been patient, but patience had a limit. "How long has this been here?" Ethan said. "On this property?" "At least 30 years. My understanding is it came from the family's primary estate before that. It may have been in the family's possession since the 1970s, but I couldn't say for certain. Does the foundation have any documentation on it? Original paperwork, registration, anything like that?" "There may be something in the estate records. I could look." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said. He stood up and looked at the car from the front again. Just the front, just the hood line and the fender curves and the empty engine bay gaping dark and cold. Without an engine, the car was silent in a way that felt specific, like a room where someone used to be. "Quite a piece of junk," Gerald said, not unkindly. "Just filling space." "Yeah," Ethan said. He took 47 photographs before he left. He photographed the frame welds, the body panel construction, the interior, what remained of it, the dashboard, the particular shape of the instrument cluster surround, the door jamb construction, the rear panel metalwork, the firewall, the engine bay mounts. He photographed the serial plate, or what was left of one, mostly illegible, one corner readable, and that corner held 3 characters that Ethan stared at for a long time through the camera lens before he took the picture. He shook Gerald's hand at the gate and thanked him. He sat in his truck and looked at his phone for a moment. Then he started the engine and drove to Sophie's school for drop-off, because it was 8:40 and Sophie needed to be at school by 8:55, and the world did not stop for anything, not even this. Not even what he thought this might be. He did not tell anyone for 4 days. This was the hardest part in some ways. Not the investigation itself, but the silence around it. Ethan had never been good at performing normalcy when something large was occupying the back of his mind, and for 4 days he went to work at the shop, replaced a clutch on a Subaru, did a brake job on an F-150, argued mildly with a parts supplier on the phone about a delayed order, picked Sophie up from school, made dinner, helped with homework, and all of it felt like something he was doing on the surface of himself while the real thing happened underneath. On Tuesday night, after Sophie was asleep, he spread his photographs across the kitchen table and went through them again with a magnifying glass. He'd already gone through them twice that day during his lunch break, but this time he was looking at them alongside a book. Not the 1987 manual, which was at the shop, but a reference text he'd found at the bottom of a box in his home office. A photographic history of coach-built European automobiles from the interwar period through the 1960s. He'd bought it at an estate sale in 2011 and read it twice and kept it because he kept things like this, the same way some people kept novels they liked. He was on page 214 when he stopped. The photograph on the left side of the spread was black and white, taken sometime in the late 1950s based on the caption. It showed a car at what appeared to be a private showing. The background was a country house of some kind, stone walls, formal garden beyond. 3 men in suits stood beside the vehicle with the particular posture of men who were in the presence of something they considered extraordinary. Ethan looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at his photograph of the front hood line and fender curve. Then he looked back at page 214. He sat very still for about 2 minutes. The car in the photograph on page 214 was documented as one of 12 examples hand-built by a small British coach-building firm between 1957 and 1961. Of those 12, 8 had been accounted for in public collections or provably documented private ownership. 1 had been confirmed destroyed in a fire in the late 1970s. 2 had been listed as unconfirmed current status for decades, which in the world of automotive history was the polite way of saying lost. And 1, the most distinctive one, built for a private client whose identity had never been fully established, had been missing since approximately 1974. Ethan picked up his flashlight photograph of the serial plate. The 3 legible characters were B, 7, and what might have been an 8 or a 3. The rust had obscured the difference. The documented serial prefix for that particular coach builder's output was B7. His hands were very steady. They were always steady. He'd trained them to be years ago because the work demanded it. But his chest was doing something that had nothing to do with training. He put the book down and looked at the kitchen ceiling for a moment. Then he got up, poured a glass of water, drank half of it standing at the sink, and came back to the table. He needed to be wrong. That was the professional obligation. You found the evidence against your conclusion before you found the evidence for it, because finding evidence for what you already believed was easy and useless. He spent the rest of that night, until 2 in the morning, going through every reason the car in the Langford Estate carriage house could not be what he suspected it was. He found 3 good reasons. He wrote them down. By Thursday, he'd found responses to all 3. On Friday afternoon, during his lunch break, he made 2 phone calls. One to a friend in the UK who worked in automotive archives at a museum in Coventry, and one to a former colleague who was now a specialist in European coach-built vehicles based in Philadelphia. He described what he'd found using careful, neutral language. He emailed the photographs separately. He asked both of them not to discuss this with anyone until he'd heard back from them. He went back to work and replaced a timing belt. "You okay?" said Danny, who was his only employee and had been working at the shop for 6 years and had therefore earned the right to ask. Danny was 24 and paid attention to things, which was his best quality as a mechanic and occasionally his most annoying quality as a person. "Fine," Ethan said. "Timing belt." "You've been weird for 3 days." "I'm always weird. Weirder than usual." Ethan handed him the socket and told him which bolt was next, and Danny, to his credit, let it go. The response from Coventry came first, 9 days after Ethan sent the photographs. Dr. Margaret Okafor, who ran the archives and whom Ethan had met at a symposium in 2008, wrote in an email that was uncharacteristically long for someone who usually communicated in 4 sentences. She had reviewed the photographs carefully. She had cross-referenced specific construction details with records in their collection. She could not make a definitive identification from photographs alone, but she believed what Ethan was looking at warranted serious formal examination by multiple specialists, and she would be willing to participate in such an examination. And did he understand what he might be holding? She did not write it that way exactly. She was a professional, and she was careful. But reading between the lines of her precise academic language, what Ethan heard was yes. 3 days after that, the Philadelphia specialist, a man named Robert Dillard, who had spent 30 years in the field and who expressed enthusiasm about almost nothing, called him back instead of emailing. "I've looked at your photos twice," Robert said, without preamble. "Where did you find this?" "It was donated to me," Ethan said, which was technically true. A pause. "By whom?" "I'd rather not say yet. I want to get proper confirmation first." "Ethan," Robert's voice was careful. "The frame construction in photograph 31. Do you know what I'm looking at?" "I have a theory. The weld pattern is consistent with—" "I know what it's consistent with." Another pause, longer. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" "Just you and Margaret Okafor." "Good. Keep it that way for now." Robert exhaled. "Ethan, if this is what I think it is, I know. The last confirmed sighting was in '74. That's 52 years. I know, Robert. If you're right, this is—" He stopped. Robert Dillard, who expressed enthusiasm about almost nothing, stopped because he had run out of the right kind of careful language. "This is significant," he finally said. "Yeah," Ethan said. He was standing in his shop parking lot, afternoon light hitting the asphalt, the ordinary sounds of the street behind him. A truck went past. Someone's dog barked twice and stopped. "I know." He hung up and stood there for a moment. Then he went inside and finished the brake job he'd left half done. Sophie had soccer practice at 5. He needed to leave by 4:40. The car that might be the most significant automotive discovery in 5 decades was sitting in a billionaire's carriage house 40 miles north under a tarp that had been thrown on it without care, with no engine and perished tires and rust that had been given decades to do its work. It had been there for 30 years at least. It could wait another day. He finished the brake job. He picked up Sophie at soccer practice. She had mud on her left shin and a scrape on her right elbow that she said was nothing, and he examined anyway. "Dad," she said, in the tone that meant he was being overly cautious. "Looks fine," he said. "You need to tell me when you fall." "I didn't fall. Maya slid into me." Same result. Very different, actually. He drove home. He made pasta because it was fast and Sophie liked it, and they ate at the kitchen table where he had spread his photographs 4 nights ago. And Sophie talked about the soccer practice and a project she was doing for school about ecosystems and a disagreement she'd had with her best friend Lily that she clearly wanted to process out loud. Ethan listened to all of it, not half-listened. Listened the real kind, the kind that required him to be fully present in the kitchen with his daughter instead of in the carriage house 40 miles north. He had gotten very good at this in the years since Sarah. It was not a gift, it was a practice, something he'd worked at, something he still had to actively choose. After dinner, after Sophie was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the book open to page 214 and looked at the black and white photograph and thought about what it meant to find something that the world had agreed was gone. He thought about the man who had built that car. He thought about the private client who had commissioned it, whose identity had never been established, whose name was probably in some document that hadn't been looked at in decades. He thought about the 52 years the car had spent in various hands and various silences, working its way through the world until it landed in a corner of a carriage house on an estate in Westfield, covered with a tarp, reduced to a philosophical problem, given away as a joke at a charity gala to a man in a too-short tie who happened to know exactly what he was looking at. There was something in that, he thought, not fate. He didn't particularly believe in fate, but something. The way things found their way to the right person eventually, through enough time and enough accidents of circumstance. The way knowledge was waiting out there in the world for the moment when it became necessary. He closed the book. He thought about the keys on their leather fob, sitting now in the small dish by his front door, where he kept his truck keys and his shop keys and the spare key to Mrs. Papadopoulos' house. 3 old keys on worn leather. He thought about the right-handed person who had carried those keys every day and used the same key every time to unlock the driver's door, who had loved that car with the unconscious daily love of something that was just part of how they moved through the world. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He slept, that night, better than he had in years. The first week after Ethan sent the photographs, he told himself he was being patient. The second week, he understood he was just waiting, which was different. Patience implied some level of peace with the situation, and there was nothing peaceful about what was happening inside him. He went to work, he fixed cars, he made dinner. He helped Sophie with a diorama about wetland ecosystems that required a specific shade of green paint they had to visit 3 different craft stores to find. He did all of it with the surface steadiness that had become his default mode over the years. And underneath it, at every hour of every day, the carriage house in Westfield was present in the back of his mind like a frequency he couldn't stop receiving. Danny noticed, of course. Danny always noticed things, which Ethan had come to think of as both the best and most exhausting quality in an employee. "You sleeping okay?" Danny said one morning, not looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "Fine," Ethan said. "You've rebuilt that same brake caliper twice." Ethan looked down. He had, in fact, disassembled and reassembled the same caliper, which was sitting on the workbench in front of him in a state of perfect completion that he had no memory of achieving. "I'm checking my work," he said. Danny made a sound that communicated significant skepticism without requiring words. The third week, things started moving. Margaret Okafor emailed from Coventry to say she had consulted with 2 colleagues in her department, and that based on the photographic evidence she was prepared to say, carefully and with the appropriate professional caveats, that they believed the vehicle warranted a full in-person inspection by a team of qualified specialists. She asked whether Ethan had notified the vehicle's current owner of his suspicions. He wrote back and said not yet. She responded, "You should do that soon, Ethan. This is not the kind of thing that benefits from being held too close." He knew she was right. He'd been knowing she was right for 2 weeks. The problem was that notifying Victoria Langford meant having a conversation he hadn't fully worked out how to have. Not because he was afraid of her exactly, but because the situation had a particular shape to it that he was aware of, and that he didn't want to distort by approaching it wrong. She had given him the car as a joke. She had handed him the keys in front of 200 people and called it a tip, and the room had laughed, and he had stood there with her laughter still in the air around him, and taken the keys and walked back to his table and not laughed. And now he was going to call her and tell her that the joke had cost her $9 million. He needed to get that right. Not for his sake, for the car's sake, which he understood was probably a strange way to think about it, but which was nonetheless accurate. The car needed to be handled correctly from this point forward. It needed to be authenticated through proper channels, documented, preserved, treated with the care that 52 years of misidentification had denied it. And that required Victoria Langford to be a cooperative participant rather than a defensive one, which meant Ethan couldn't walk into that conversation with any trace of told you so, regardless of how thoroughly the situation warranted it. He thought about it for 3 more days. Then he called. Her assistant answered, because of course she had an assistant. Ethan gave his name and said he needed to speak with Ms. Langford about the vehicle that had been donated at the Foundation Gala. The assistant put him on hold for 4 minutes and came back to say that Ms. Langford could speak with him Thursday at 2 o'clock. Ethan said that worked. He hung up and went back to the alternator he'd been testing and stared at it without seeing it for approximately 30 seconds before he made himself focus. Thursday arrived. He called from the shop office at 2 o'clock precisely because he was a person who was on time to things. Victoria picked up herself, which surprised him. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice on the phone was slightly different than it had been at the gala. Less performed, more direct. "My assistant said it was about the car." "Yes," Ethan said. "I've been doing some research on it. I assumed you'd request to have it towed somewhere. I was going to ask Gerald to make the arrangements. I'd like to hold off on moving it for now." A brief pause. "Why?" This was the moment. He'd rehearsed several versions of it. And now, sitting in his shop office with the sounds of the garage outside his door, all the rehearsed versions left him, and he just said what was true. Because I think it might be considerably more valuable than either of us believed when you gave it to me. The silence lasted long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. How considerably, Victoria said. Her voice had not changed in pitch or pace, but something in it had gone very still. I don't want to say a number yet. I don't have enough confirmation, but I've been in contact with specialists in the UK and on the East Coast, and I'm asking you to hold off on any decisions about the vehicle until we can get a formal inspection done. Another pause. Mr. Mercer, I gave that car away. I know. At a charity event. In front of 200 people. I know that too. So legally, Ms. Langford, Ethan said, and he kept his voice even. I'm not calling you about the legal question. I'm calling you because I think you deserve to know what might be sitting in your carriage house. What we do about it after we know for certain, that's a different conversation. But right now, I think you should know. The silence this time was different, less calculating, more genuine. How long have you known? She said. I've had a strong suspicion for about 3 weeks. And you're telling me now? I'm telling you now, he agreed. She exhaled, a small, controlled sound. How formal is this inspection process? It will take time to arrange properly, probably 4 to 6 weeks to get the right people together. Margaret Okafor at the Coventry Automotive Archive is willing to be involved, Robert Dillard in Philadelphia, possibly 1 or 2 others depending on what the initial examination shows. And in the meantime, the car stays in Westfield. Yes, and I'd recommend limited access, just Gerald and whoever he designates. No photos leaving the property, nothing discussed outside of the people already involved. You've been keeping this quiet, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. Why? You could have gone to the press with this the day you found it. That would have been... She stopped, and Ethan had the impression she was catching herself mid-thought. That would have made for an interesting story. That's not why I do this work, Ethan said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Victoria Langford said, in a tone that had lost almost all of its executive polish, I'll have Gerald secure the building. Send me the names of the specialists and I'll make sure they have full access. Thank you, Ethan said. Mr. Mercer. She paused. I owe you an apology for the way the gala was handled. The presentation of the vehicle was meant to be... It's fine, Ethan said. Because it was, mostly, and because he didn't need it from her right then. There would be time for whatever that conversation was. Right now there was a car that had been lost for 52 years, and it needed his attention more than he needed her apology. It's not fine, she said quietly, but I'll tell Gerald to expect the specialists. They hung up. Ethan sat with his phone on the desk for a moment. Then he opened his email and wrote to Margaret Okafor and Robert Dillard and told them to start making arrangements. The arrangements took 5 weeks, which was faster than Ethan had expected, mostly because Margaret had more pull than he'd realized in the specific community of people who cared about this kind of thing. And once she made a few calls, the interest was immediate. The inspection team that assembled at the Westfield estate on a Tuesday morning in October was 6 people. Margaret, who had flown in from the UK, Robert Dillard, who had driven up from Philadelphia. A metallurgical specialist named Dr. Yoon Park from the University of Michigan, who could analyze the specific alloy composition of the body panels. A coachwork historian named Francis Elroy, who had written 2 of the 3 serious texts on British independent coach builders of the post-war period. An authentication specialist from an insurance company that handled high-value automotive coverage, and Ethan. Ethan had been to the carriage house 4 times since his initial visit. Each time he'd brought better equipment, a higher-powered work light, a camera with a macro lens, an ultrasound thickness gauge for measuring panel construction, a fiber optic scope that he'd borrowed from a medical equipment supplier and which could get into spaces no human hand could reach. Each visit had added evidence. Each piece of evidence had made the likelihood greater and the waiting harder. The morning of the inspection, he arrived at 7. The specialists arrived between 7:30 and 8. Victoria had not come, which Ethan had half expected. She'd sent Gerald and a lawyer whose presence Ethan noted without comment, and who stood near the carriage house door and did not interfere with anything. The morning was cold and clear, October doing what October does in that part of the country, the light arriving low and sharp across the property. They worked for 6 hours. Ethan mostly stayed out of the way and answered questions when someone had them, which was not his natural instinct. His instinct was to be in the middle of it, hands-on, the way he always was with a vehicle. But this wasn't his car, and the specialists needed room to do what they did, and so he stood back and watched and answered and occasionally pointed to something specific when Francis or Margaret needed him to explain what he'd found on a previous visit. At one point, about 3 hours in, Francis Elroy, who was 71 years old and had the careful movements of someone who had spent decades treating fragile things carefully, crouched at the front of the vehicle with a magnifying lens and looked at the particular way the fender met the hood, and then he looked up at Ethan, and something in his expression made Ethan's chest do the same thing it had done at the kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. The swage line, Francis said. He meant the crease in the bodywork, a design signature so specific to the builder that it appeared in no other documented vehicle. You saw it immediately? Not immediately, Ethan said, but quickly. Francis looked at it for another moment. How did you learn to see this? Same way you did, Ethan said. A long time of paying attention. Francis made a sound that was almost a laugh. He straightened up with the slight effort of a man of 71 straightening up after crouching, and he looked at the car the way Ethan had looked at it from the beginning, like it was something that deserved to be looked at properly. I never believed we'd find her, he said quietly. Not to Ethan specifically, maybe to himself, maybe to the room. Ethan didn't say anything. They broke for lunch. Gerald had arranged sandwiches, which everyone ate quickly, most of them talking through the food in the particular animated way that people talk when they're in the middle of something significant that they've been waiting their whole careers for. The metallurgical analysis would take time to process. Yun Park had taken surface samples that would go to the lab, and the results wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. The authentication specialist from the insurance company was thorough and methodical, and asked more questions than anyone else, and wrote everything down in a notebook. Robert Dillard had barely spoken all morning, which Ethan recognized as Robert being more affected than he was letting on. It was Robert who found the notebook. Late in the afternoon, when the light inside the carriage house had changed and they were doing a final survey of the interior, Robert was examining the storage compartment beneath the rear parcel shelf. A small, lockable space that was standard on this particular coach builder's designs. The compartment lock was seized. Ethan had noticed it on his second visit and had left it, not wanting to force anything without the right people present. Robert worked on the lock with a pick set for about 10 minutes, with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who knew how to wait. The lock gave. He lifted the compartment lid and looked inside, and then he stopped moving. Ethan, he said. Ethan crossed the floor. Inside the compartment, in a space roughly the size of a shoebox, there was a notebook. Brown leather cover, swollen from age, the leather darkened and the pages visibly degraded from decades of temperature fluctuation. It had not been well protected, and it showed. But it was there. Nobody moved for a moment. We don't open it here, Margaret said. She was already moving toward her bag for gloves and an archival evidence sleeve. We need proper handling. The notebook came out of the compartment and into Margaret's care with the reverence that the situation warranted, and the afternoon light was going by then, and the inspection was declared complete for the day, with the understanding that written findings would follow over the coming weeks. They stood outside the carriage house in the cold air afterward, most of them with the slightly hollowed look of people who had been intensely focused for a long time and were now releasing it. Yun Park said something to Robert in a low voice. Francis Elroy stood apart, looking at the ground, probably doing in his head what Ethan was doing in his, running through the evidence, looking for the holes, the places where certainty broke down into something smaller. What do you think? Margaret said to Ethan quietly, standing beside him. I think it's her, Ethan said. So do I. She looked at him. How are you feeling about all of this? He thought about it honestly. Complicated, he said. She nodded like that was exactly the right answer. He drove home in the dark, the 40 miles going by in the way miles go by when you're not really registering them, your body doing the work of driving while your mind is somewhere else. He thought about the notebook in Margaret's archival sleeve. He thought about what might be written in it. The coach builder's notes, maybe. Personal records. The name of the original owner, possibly. The identity that had never been established. He thought about 52 years of a car sitting in various darknesses, not knowing what it was, not having anyone around who knew enough to recognize it. He picked up Sophie from Mrs. Papadopoulos' house at 7:30. She had been doing homework and was 3/4 finished with her math, which she wanted to complete before she told him about her day, because Sophie had a system about these things. He sat at the kitchen table while she finished the math, and he drank coffee, and when she was done, she closed the workbook and looked at him with the direct attention that children have when they've decided you're the subject. "You found something important today," she said. Not a question. "What makes you say that?" "You look like how you looked when you found that old engine in the barn 2 years ago, except more." He looked at his daughter, who was 9 and had her mother's eyes and the particular intelligence that Sarah had carried so naturally, the kind that observed before it spoke. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." The car from the party. He'd told her, in broad terms, that the car from the gala might be more interesting than people thought. He hadn't told her specifics, mostly because he hadn't wanted to make it real before he was certain. "Maybe," he said. "How much more interesting?" He thought about how to say it. "The kind of interesting that people write books about," he said. She considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Is it good for you? Like, a good kind of interesting?" He thought about the swage line. He thought about the weld work under the flashlight. He thought about Frances Elroy saying, "I never believed we'd find her." "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Good," Sophie said, and slid off her chair to start clearing the table, because they had a system about that too. The weeks that followed had a particular texture to them, still ordinary on the surface, deeply not ordinary underneath. Reports came in. Park's metallurgical analysis confirmed that the alloy composition of the body panels was consistent with the specific proprietary mix that the coach builder had used during the period in question, a mix that was documented in the builder's own technical records held at a museum in Hampshire. The authentication specialist filed a preliminary report with the insurance company that covered Victoria's estate collection, which triggered a formal valuation process. Margaret's team at Coventry worked on the notebook. The degraded pages required humidification and careful physical treatment before they could be opened without causing further damage, and this took time. And the knowledge that the notebook was sitting in a conservation lab being patiently coaxed back to readability was the specific kind of patience test that Ethan found harder than all the others. News moved through the specialist community in the way news moved in small, specialized worlds, with a speed that bore no relationship to how slowly these things moved in the wider world. Ethan started receiving emails from people he hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues. A curator at a European automotive museum who had heard something through Frances Elroy's network and wanted to know if the rumors were accurate. A journalist at an automotive publication who had gotten a tip from somewhere and called the shop twice, which Ethan didn't return. He talked to a lawyer of his own, not because he intended to fight over ownership. The car had been given to him, freely, at a public event, in front of witnesses, but because he wanted to understand exactly what his position was before anyone else tried to define it for him. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had done some work for the Automotive Preservation Society and whom Carl had recommended, walked him through the situation with the kind of clear-eyed practicality that he appreciated. The transfer had been legally clean, the keys had been presented publicly, the gift was documented by at least a dozen witnesses. Whatever complications might emerge were complications of conscience and relationship, not of law. "Do you have any intention of claiming ownership?" Patricia asked, across a desk in her office. "I haven't decided," Ethan said. She looked at him. "That's an interesting answer for someone in your position." "There are things that matter more than what I'm legally entitled to," he said. "I want to make sure the car is authenticated properly. I want to make sure it's handled right going forward. What happens to it after that is a conversation I'd rather have when all the facts are on the table." Patricia nodded slowly. "You should be aware that the current legal landscape significantly favors you." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm just not sure that's the point." She didn't push it further, which was why he'd liked her from the start. The formal confirmation arrived on a Thursday morning in November. Ethan was doing an oil change when his phone buzzed, and he looked at it and saw Robert Dillard's name and stepped outside. "It's confirmed," Robert said. 3 words. Ethan leaned against the outside wall of the shop with one hand and looked at the parking lot. "All 3 independent assessors have signed off," Robert continued. "The metallurgical analysis, the coachwork documentation, the construction methodology, everything is consistent, and Margaret's team finished with the notebook yesterday. They were able to read approximately 80% of the legible pages." "What's in it?" Ethan said. "Construction notes mostly. The builder's personal record of the commission, materials, dimensions, specifications, and the client's name, Ethan. They found the original client's name, which means they can start tracing the provenance, which is going to fill in everything." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Behind him through the shop wall, he could hear Danny's radio playing something he couldn't identify from the outside. "Current valuation estimate?" he asked. "The insurance company's preliminary figure is $8.5 million. Francis thinks the auction market would be higher. He said 9, possibly 9.5, depending on the venue and the provenance documentation. The notebook alone adds significant value. $8.5 million, sitting in a billionaire's carriage house under a tarp, given away as a joke." "Robert," Ethan said. "Yeah. Who else knows the confirmation is through?" "Margaret, myself, the 3 assessors, the insurance specialist. That's it. Francis knows the analysis is complete, but he hasn't been told the final determination yet." A pause. "You should be the one to tell the owner. Miss Langford." "I know," Ethan said. "And Ethan, the press is going to get this eventually, probably sooner than you'd like. You need to have your ducks in a row before that happens." "I know that too," Ethan said. He thanked Robert and hung up. He stood outside for another minute. A car pulled into the parking lot, and a woman got out and looked at him with the mild puzzlement of a customer who wasn't sure if the person leaning against the wall was available to help her. He straightened up. "Oil change?" she said. "Come on in," he said. "Danny'll take care of you." He went inside and gave Danny the keys the woman handed over and went to his office and closed the door, which he almost never did. He sat at his desk. He thought about calling Victoria directly. He thought about what he was going to say, and this time there was no rehearsing it, because the facts were going to have to speak for themselves, and he was going to have to trust that she was capable of hearing them. He thought about the gala, the spotlight finding him at table 11, the polished smile and the keys on the leather fob and the room full of people laughing with the easy release of an audience that has been given permission to find something funny. He thought about walking back to his table and sitting down and picking up his water glass and feeling the laughter settle around him like weather. He hadn't been angry. That was the thing he kept coming back to when he examined the memory. He hadn't been angry at the gala, and he wasn't angry now. What he'd felt standing at that podium was something more complicated, a kind of sorrow, not for himself, but for the situation, for the gap between what people were willing to see and what was actually there if they'd taken 30 seconds to look. That gap had cost Victoria Langford something significant. It would be easy to be satisfied by that. He chose not to be. He picked up his phone and called her number. Her assistant answered. Ethan said he needed to speak with Ms. Langford and that it was about the vehicle inspection. He was on hold for 2 minutes this time, not 4, which he noticed. "Mr. Mercer," Victoria said. "The authentication is complete," Ethan said. "The vehicle has been formally confirmed." A silence. "Confirmed as what exactly?" she said. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. "As the car that's been missing since 1974. The full provenance is still being worked out, but the technical confirmation is complete. 3 independent assessors. The preliminary valuation is between $8 and $9.5 million, depending on how the provenance documentation develops." The silence this time was longer than any of the silences before it. "Are you serious?" she said. Not angrily, in the tone of someone who has just had the ground shift under them and hasn't finished catching their balance. "Yes," Ethan said. "The car I gave away as a—" She stopped. He heard her exhale. "The car I gave away." "Yes." Another long silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that Ethan hadn't heard from her before. Less of everything that was professional and controlled and carefully positioned, more of something that was just human and caught off guard. I don't even know what to say to you right now. You don't have to say anything right now, Ethan said. There's going to be a lot to process. The provenance documentation will take some time. Margaret Okafor's team is working on the notebook. There's a client name, which will allow them to trace the full ownership history, and at some point there will be press, which both of us are going to have to navigate. How long have you known it was confirmed? About an hour? You called me within an hour. I thought you should know, Ethan said. The line was quiet. He could hear something in the background on her end, an air conditioning system or a heater, the ambient sound of a large office. Then she said, "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" In terms of, I need to understand what your position is. What I want right now is for the car to be properly handled, secured, climate controlled, kept away from anyone who shouldn't have access. I want the authentication process to be done through the right channels, which it is. I want the provenance to be documented completely so that the car's history is established for the record. He paused. Everything else is a conversation we can have when the time is right. I'm not trying to create a problem for you. You've had every legal right to walk away from this with the car, she said. You didn't have to tell me anything. I know, Ethan said. Another silence, shorter this time. I owe you more than an apology, she said. Let's start with the apology, Ethan said, and see where things go from there. He heard something that might have been a short, surprise sound. Not quite a laugh, but close. All right, she said quietly. All right, I'll have my team coordinate with Ms. Okafor about securing the vehicle. Thank you, he said. He hung up. He looked at the surface of his desk for a moment, the pens and the ceramic cup Sophie had made in art class 2 years ago, the stack of invoices he needed to file, the coffee ring on the corner that he kept meaning to wipe off. All of it ordinary, all of it exactly what it had been before the call. He opened the door and went back out to the shop floor where Danny was halfway through the oil change. Everything okay? Danny said, not looking up. Yeah, Ethan said. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands from the previous job. A habit, something to do with his hands. That Camry that came in Tuesday. Did you get a look at the suspension? Front struts are going, Danny said. Left side for certain, probably both. Write it up and call the owner, Ethan said. Give her the accurate number, not the soft one. Always do, Danny said. Ethan nodded and went to find the next thing that needed doing. The press got it on a Wednesday. Ethan didn't find out until Danny came into the office at 8:15 in the morning, holding his phone like it was evidence of something, which it was. There's an article, Danny said. Automotive Heritage Monthly, online, posted about an hour ago. Ethan took the phone. The headline was measured, as these things went in specialist publications. Missing coach-built masterpiece located in New England estate after 5 decades. But the subheading was less so, and the photograph they'd used, which appeared to have been taken during the inspection without anyone's knowledge or consent, showed the front quarter of the car with enough identifying detail to make the story real to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Ethan read the first 3 paragraphs and handed the phone back. How'd they get the photo? Danny said. I don't know. He didn't, but he had a general theory about how information moved in small specialist communities, and it involved the same human frailties that caused information to move everywhere else. Someone told someone they trusted, and that person told someone they trusted slightly less, and so on until eventually there was a journalist. He called Margaret first. She'd already seen it. I'm sorry, she said, which meant she had some theory about the source too and felt responsible for the community she'd brought into the process. I should have been more explicit about confidentiality. It would have gotten out eventually, Ethan said. I'm just glad we got the formal confirmation documented before the public version. The story will grow, Margaret said. You understand that. Once the general press picks this up, I know, Ethan said. Have you spoken to Ms. Langford? I'll call her after this. He called Patricia Chen next. Patricia had also seen it. She'd set a news alert at some point, which was exactly the kind of thing Patricia did. Your phone is going to start ringing from numbers you don't recognize, she said. Don't answer them. Route everything through me, or just don't pick up. I have a business to run, Ethan said. People call the shop. Forward the shop line to a new number for a while. I'll have my assistant screen, Patricia. I know, you're not going to do that. She exhaled. Just let it go to voicemail and call me before you call anyone back. Anyone. Journalists, collectors, whoever, even if they seem harmless. He called Victoria's office. Her assistant picked up with a wariness in her voice that told Ethan the call had been anticipated. He was put through in under a minute, which was the fastest yet. I saw it, Victoria said before he could speak. She sounded like someone who had been awake for a while. My PR team has been in my office since 6 this morning. I'm sorry about the timing, Ethan said. I don't know how the photo got out. Marcus, she said it flatly, like something she'd already worked out. My estate manager's assistant. He was there for part of the inspection. He wouldn't have known what he was doing was a problem, which makes it hard to be genuinely angry about it, which makes it more frustrating. A pause. My lawyers are asking me to make a statement by noon. What kind of statement? The kind that controls the narrative before someone else does. She said it without apparent irony, which meant it was just a thing she said naturally. Narrative control, the management of public perception. The vocabulary of someone whose professional life was substantially made up of those things. What are you going to say? Ethan asked, a pause that held more weight than it seemed to. I was hoping to talk to you about that first. He was quiet for a moment. Through the office window, he could see Danny outside, standing in the lot with his phone, probably reading more of the article. I have a lawyer too, Ethan said. Patricia Chen. I'd like her to be part of that conversation. Of course, Victoria said. Quickly, without hesitation, which told him something about where she was positioning herself. Can you do this afternoon? My office or somewhere neutral, wherever you're comfortable. Somewhere neutral, Ethan said. They agreed on a hotel conference room in the city, 2 o'clock, which gave Ethan enough time to finish the morning's jobs, close the shop early, change out of his work clothes, and drive 45 minutes without speeding. He called Patricia from the parking lot of his shop, and she said she'd be there, and he should not speak to anyone between now and then without her in the room. The general press caught the story by 10 in the morning. By 11, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets, neither of them primarily automotive publications, which meant the story had crossed out of specialist territory into something broader. The angle that both pieces took was the one that Ethan had known was inevitable the moment the facts were arranged the way they were. The single father, the gala, the joke, the rusted car worth $9 million. It was a good story. It had everything a good story needed, including a villain who wasn't quite a villain and a hero who wasn't trying to be heroic, which were the best kinds of those roles because they were complicated enough to feel true. One headline said, Expert's Eye turns billionaire's gag gift into $9 million discovery. Another said, She gave it away as a joke. He knew better. The photo they used for Ethan was pulled from the Millbrook Automotive Preservation Society's website. A 3-year-old headshot from a chapter newsletter, slightly blurry, him in his shop with grease on his forearm that he hadn't noticed when it was taken. His phone produced 17 notifications before he turned it face down. Danny appeared in the office doorway. A guy from Channel 7 just called the shop number. Tell him we're not available and take a message. I told him you were with a customer. Danny paused. You don't have a customer. I will in a minute, Ethan said. Mrs. Henderson's Civic needs the fuel injectors looked at, and she's been waiting 2 days. Call her. Danny looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who wanted to say several things and was choosing not to. Okay, he said, and went to make the call. Ethan closed the office door again and sat with the quiet for a moment. He thought about the article. He thought about the photograph of the car's front quarter, reproduced on screens he would never see, in places he would never know about, being looked at by people who would form opinions about all of it. The car, the discovery, the gala, him, Victoria. The story existed now in the world beyond his management of it, and that was both inevitable and uncomfortable, the way most inevitable things were. He thought about Sophie. She would see it at some point, or more likely, another kid at school would see it first and tell her, which was a worse way to find out. He picked up his phone and called the school and asked to leave a message for Sophie's teacher, Ms. Adeyemi, explaining briefly that there was a news story involving the family and that Sophie might hear about it from other students, and he wanted the school to be aware. Ms. Adeyemi called back in 7 minutes, which was faster than he'd expected and made him grateful in a way he hadn't anticipated. She said she'd keep an eye out and that Sophie was fine as of morning attendance. He drove to the city with his phone producing occasional sounds from the cup holder that he mostly ignored. Patricia was waiting in the hotel lobby when he arrived, which was characteristic of her. She was always somewhere before you expected her to be. She handed him a bottle of water without preamble and said, "Before we go in, 3 things." "Okay," Ethan said. 1. You do not agree to anything today. This meeting is information exchange, not negotiation. If she wants to negotiate, we schedule a separate meeting for that. Fine. 2. You don't volunteer the details of any conversations you've had with the specialist unless directly asked, and even then you defer to me. Fine. 3. She looked at him directly. What do you want out of this, Ethan? I need to know before we sit down. Not legally. I know the legal landscape. What do you actually want? He'd been thinking about this, in the spaces between the oil change and the fuel injectors and the phone calls, for several hours. I want the car to be authenticated completely and documented properly, he said. I want the provenance to be established on the record. I want the notebook's contents to be preserved and archived somewhere appropriate. He paused. And I want to be treated like a person who contributed something to this, rather than an inconvenience in someone else's asset management situation. Patricia nodded once, the way she nodded when something matched what she'd already concluded. Good, that's workable. She gestured toward the elevator. Let's go. Victoria was already in the conference room with 2 people, a man Ethan didn't recognize who turned out to be her general counsel, and a woman who was introduced as her head of communications. The communications person had the particular alertness of someone who managed crises professionally and was currently in the middle of managing one. Victoria stood when Ethan and Patricia entered. She looked different in this context than she had at the gala, less curated, though she was still put together in the way that some people always were. The difference was something in her expression, an absence of the performance quality that had characterized every version of her Ethan had seen before. She looked like someone who had been genuinely caught off guard and hadn't fully recovered her positioning, which he found more human than anything else he'd seen from her. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Ethan said. They sat. Patricia set a notepad on the table and uncapped a pen and did not write anything for the first several minutes, which Ethan knew from prior experience was a tactic. It made the other side aware that the pen existed without giving them information about what was being recorded. Victoria's general counsel did not waste time on pleasantries. He was a man in his late 50s named Harrison, and he had the compressed professional energy of someone who billed by the hour and was aware of it at all times. The Foundation's position is that the transfer of the vehicle at the gala was conducted informally and without proper valuation, Harrison said. Given the significant discrepancy between the understood value at time of transfer and the confirmed value, "Harrison," Victoria said. He stopped. She looked at Ethan. "I asked you here today because I want to handle this right. Not legally right. I mean, genuinely right." She glanced briefly at her counsel, who had the look of a man who had advised against this approach and been overruled. "So I'm going to say something that Harrison thinks I shouldn't say, which is that I know the legal situation. I know where Mr. Mercer stands, and I'm not here to fight that." She paused. "I'm here because I want to understand what happened and what we do now, and I wanted to do that face-to-face rather than through lawyers." Patricia made a small mark on her notepad. Ethan looked at Victoria for a moment. "Okay," he said. "How long did you actually know?" she said. "I don't mean when the confirmation came in. I mean, when did you know?" "The night of the gala," Ethan said. "Not with certainty, but I had enough to know I needed to look at it." Something crossed her face. "From the keys?" "From the keys," he confirmed. "The bow shape, the stitching on the fob, the wear pattern. It was enough to make me want to see the car." She was quiet for a moment. "And when you saw the car?" "The hood line," Ethan said, "and the swage line on the front fender once I got close enough. I wasn't certain. You can't be certain from looking. but I was certain enough to need to verify. And you didn't say anything at the gala? No. Why not? He thought about how to answer this honestly. Because saying something without verification would have been irresponsible. And because, he paused, trying to find the accurate version of it, it wasn't the right room for that conversation. The right room for that conversation was the carriage house with the right people and the right equipment. Victoria looked at the table for a moment. Then she said quietly, "My grandfather collected for 40 years. He had extraordinary things. The cars in the climate-controlled bays," she gestured vaguely, meaning the Westfield property. "He loved those. He talked about them. He knew their histories." She looked up. "I never understood why that one was just back there, under a tarp. He never mentioned it. I assumed it was something that had come in damaged and never got dealt with." "It probably came in toward the end of his collecting years," Ethan said. "If he acquired it in the early 70s, he died in 1978, Victoria said. He was sick from about 1975 on. The room was quiet for a moment. "He may have known what it was," Ethan said, "or he may have suspected and never had the chance to verify. Either way, it was there. In his collection, he kept it." Something in Victoria's expression shifted, a small private thing, and she looked down at the table again. Harrison cleared his throat. "If we could discuss the practical—" "In a minute," Victoria said without looking at him. Ethan gave her the moment. Then she straightened and looked at him with something that was more direct than anything she'd managed so far. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" "Not legally. What do you actually want?" He noticed that she'd asked almost exactly the same question Patricia had asked him 40 minutes earlier. "I want it handled correctly," he said. "The authentication, the provenance, the preservation. I want the notebook's contents in a proper archive. And I want it acknowledged, publicly, clearly, that the identification was made possible by specific knowledge that took a long time to develop." He paused. "Not for my ego, because it's accurate, and because accuracy matters when you're talking about how something like this gets found." She held his gaze. "And the car itself?" "I haven't decided," Ethan said. Harrison shifted in his chair. Patricia made another small mark on her notepad. "What would help you decide?" Victoria asked. "Time," Ethan said, "and the full provenance. Once we know the complete ownership history, who commissioned it, how it moved through the world, how it ended up in your grandfather's estate, that context will matter." She nodded slowly. The communications person, who had been quiet throughout, leaned toward Victoria and said something too low for Ethan to hear. Victoria shook her head slightly, a small definitive no. "I'd like to make a joint statement," Victoria said. "My communications team has a draft. I'd want your input on it, specifically on how your role is characterized." "Patricia will need to review it," Ethan said. "Of course." Victoria looked at Patricia directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "We'll send over a draft this afternoon. We'll review it tonight," Patricia said, "and have comments back by end of day tomorrow." The meeting lasted another 20 minutes and covered logistics: the car's transfer to a proper climate-controlled facility, the timeline for the remaining provenance research, the question of when and how to announce the complete authentication findings. Harrison spoke more in these 20 minutes than he had in the preceding hour, because logistics were his territory and he was efficient in them. The communications woman spoke too, laying out a framework for the public narrative that was competent and thorough, and treated Ethan's role with a respect that he suspected reflected Victoria's instructions rather than natural instinct. When it was over, Victoria walked with Ethan to the elevator while the others gathered materials. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I said it on the phone, but I want to say it in person." She paused, and the pause had a quality of someone who was actually thinking rather than performing. The gala, the way that was set up, it was meant to be entertainment. I didn't consider that there might be a person in the room who would be genuinely affected by it. "You didn't know," Ethan said. "I should have. That's the thing." She looked at him with the directness that was, he was starting to understand, her actual default mode when the performance layer came off. Not comfortable and warm like the gala version, but more real. I looked at the invitation list and I saw Millbrook Automotive Preservation Society representative, and I thought, I thought it would be someone who would appreciate the joke, not, she gestured vaguely. Not someone who would actually know what the car was, Ethan said. Not someone with anything real at stake, she said, which was the more honest version. He thought about that. I've been doing this work for 15 years, he said. Before that, I was doing it differently, in bigger rooms with more money involved. But the knowledge is the same. It accumulates, and it stays. He looked at the elevator numbers above the door. Most people in those rooms at galas like yours don't have what I have. You were probably right statistically. It was just bad luck. Or good luck, she said quietly. For the car. The elevator arrived. Ethan held the door. Yes, he said, for the car. He drove back to Millbrook in the late afternoon light, which was the particular low gold of November, trying its best. He stopped at the grocery store before picking up Sophie because there was nothing at home for dinner, and he'd promised her something other than pasta, a promise he'd been repeatedly not keeping because pasta was fast, and he was tired most evenings. He stood in the grocery store with a basket and called Mrs. Papadopoulos to ask if Sophie was okay being picked up at 6 instead of 5:30. Mrs. Papadopoulos said yes, and also that she'd seen the news item and that it was very exciting and was everything okay, and he said yes, and she said she knew he'd say that, and he thanked her and hung up. He bought ingredients for the chicken soup that Sophie's grandmother, his mother, had made when he was small, which he'd learned to make adequately, but not excellently, which was good enough. He drove to Mrs. Papadopoulos's and picked up Sophie, who got in the truck with a particular quality of contained energy that told him she'd been sitting on something all afternoon. He pulled out of the driveway. Okay, he said. Lily's mom showed her the article, Sophie said. I figured something like that. Lily said you were famous. I'm not famous. Miss Adiemi talked to me at lunch and asked if I was okay. I know. I called the school this morning. Sophie looked at him. You called? I wanted them to know before you heard it from someone else. She was quiet for a moment, processing this. Was it weird today with all the... She made a gesture that encompassed the news and the phone calls and everything else. A little, he said, but the car is really worth that much? Like the article said? Between 8 and 9.5 million, approximately, depending on factors that haven't been fully determined yet. That's a lot of money. Yes, he agreed. Are we going to be rich? He considered how to answer this honestly in a way that a 9-year-old could use. That's not determined yet, he said. There are a lot of conversations that still need to happen. She nodded slowly in the way that she sometimes processed information, not demanding the rest of it, just filing what she had for now. Then she said, Is the woman sorry? The one who gave it to you like a joke? She apologized today, Ethan said, in person. What did you say? That she didn't know. Sophie thought about this. That's very mature of you, she said, in the tone that was a direct imitation of something she'd heard an adult say, which happened more and more now that she was 9 and in possession of a larger vocabulary. Despite everything, Ethan almost laughed. Thank you, he said. Did you mean it? Yeah, he said. I think so. The soup that evening was better than it usually was, which he attributed to having bought a better cut of chicken and to having more time than usual since he'd left the shop early. Sophie declared it good, which she did not do unless she meant it. They ate and she talked about a book she was reading for school, and he listened and asked questions about the part where the main character made a decision that Sophie found questionable. She explained her position thoroughly. He found he agreed with most of it. After dinner, he called Carl Briggs, which he'd been putting off all day because Carl had been sending texts since 10 in the morning with an escalating enthusiasm that Ethan didn't have the energy to match in real time. Carl answered on the first ring. Ethan, Carl said with the energy of a man who had been waiting for this call for 8 hours. Are you seeing all of this? The National Automotive Heritage Association put out a statement. The museum in Coventry posted a piece on their website. There's a... Carl, Ethan said. I know. I've been dealing with it all day. We should put out a chapter statement. The society should be part of... The society can put out a statement, sure. But keep my name out of it for now. Let Patricia's office handle any direct statements about me. A pause. Carl was a good man and a genuine enthusiast. But he was also someone who lived substantially in the world of recognition and prestige that surrounded the preservation community, and the possibility of the society being associated with something like this was lighting him up in ways that Ethan understood but couldn't entirely share. "Are you going to do press?" Carl said. "Not yet," Ethan said. "Maybe not for a while." "Ethan, this is significant. I've been in this community for 30 years and I've never seen anything like this. You could—" "Carl," Ethan said. He kept his voice even. "I know what this is. I've known for about 8 weeks. I need to let it develop the right way, not the fast way. Okay?" A pause, shorter. "Yeah, okay." Carl, to his credit, knew when to back down. "But when you're ready, you'll be one of the first calls," Ethan said. And he meant it. He checked his email after Sophie went to bed. There were 43 unread messages from addresses he didn't recognize, which Patricia had predicted and which he left unread. There were 3 from Robert Dillard, updating him on conversations that had started happening in the specialist community following the article. There was 1 from Francis Elroy, which was short and had the quality of something written by an elderly man who used email like Telegram. "The world is paying attention. Hold the line. F.E." He read that one twice. There was also, at 8:47 in the evening, 1 from Victoria Langford. No subject line. It was 3 sentences. "The draft statement from my team is attached. I've asked them to revise the 3rd paragraph to more accurately reflect your expertise. I thought you should see it before Patricia does. As a courtesy, not as pressure." He opened the attachment. The draft was professionally written and factually accurate, and described Ethan as a leading expert in classic vehicle restoration and identification whose specialized knowledge made this discovery possible. The 3rd paragraph, which she'd flagged, had been revised to remove a line that had originally attributed the discovery to the vehicle's inclusion in the Foundation's collection, which was a subtle way of centering the Langford name in a story that wasn't actually about them. She'd caught it and fixed it. He didn't know whether she'd caught it herself or whether someone on her team had flagged it, but either way, she'd fixed it before showing it to him, which meant something. He forwarded it to Patricia with a note that said, "She sent this ahead of the agreed timeline. See 3rd paragraph," and left it at that. He sat for a moment in the quiet house. The heat came on through the vents with the familiar sound it made in November, that particular metallic click followed by the rush of warm air. He could hear it in Sophie's room too, through the wall. The same click and rush, the house keeping her warm. He thought about the notebook sitting in Margaret's conservation lab, its pages being coaxed open by people who knew how to be patient with fragile things. He thought about the name they'd found in it, the original client, the person who had sat down with the coach builder in 1958 or 1959 and said, "Here is what I want, here is what matters to me, here is what this car should be." That person had spent real money and real intention on a thing that they loved, and the thing had moved through the world for 60-odd years and ended up in a carriage house under a tarp, and now it was known again. Documented. Real in the historical record in a way it hadn't been for 50 years. There was something right about that, not in a sentimental way, just in the basic sense that things that existed deserved to be known for what they were, and that knowledge was worth protecting, and that the people who held that knowledge had a responsibility to use it when the moment came. He'd used it. That felt correct. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The morning came the way mornings did, indifferent to everything that had happened the day before, requiring the same things it always required: coffee, breakfast, Sophie's lunch packed before 7:40, the school run, the shop, the ordinary machinery of a day that didn't pause for discoveries or press coverage or complicated conversations in hotel conference rooms. Danny was already there when Ethan arrived, which was unusual, and he'd made coffee, which was more unusual. He handed Ethan a cup without comment. "You saw the Channel 7 piece," Ethan said. "It was on at my mom's last night," Danny said. He paused. "They used your newsletter photo." "I know. You look kind of annoyed in it." "I was," Ethan said. "The carburetor in that picture had a cracked bowl." Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that comes out when something surprises you into it. "Okay," he said. "What are we doing today?" "The Camry struts," Ethan said, And there's a Land Rover coming in at 10 that's been making a sound the owner can't describe. Walk me through what you know about the NAS ones from that era before it arrives." "Right," Danny said, and started talking, and that was the day. 3 days later, the provenance research produced something that nobody had expected. Margaret called in the early afternoon while Ethan was eating lunch at his desk, which was a sandwich he'd made that morning and which had been better 3 hours ago. "We have the full client name," she said. "And Ethan, the ownership chain is complete. We can trace it unbroken from the original commission in 1959 all the way to the Langford estate." "How?" Ethan said. He put the sandwich down. The notebook had the client's name and address, a private collector in Surrey, a man named Thomas Arden. We tracked the estate records and he died in 1969. The car passed to his son, also Thomas, who sold the collection in 1973. The buyer at that sale, a pause that held something in it, was Edward Langford. Ethan sat very still. "Victoria's grandfather," Margaret said. "He didn't stumble across it or acquire it anonymously. He bought it at a private sale in Surrey in 1973, 1 year before it was reported missing from public record. He knew what it was, Ethan. He paid full documented price for it and brought it to the States." "Why was it never disclosed?" Ethan said. "We don't know yet. The notebook. There's a section near the back that might speak to that, but the pages are still in conservation. Maybe another week." She paused. "But the effect was that it disappeared from any public registry. The sale was private, the documentation stayed in the Arden estate, and Edward Langford died in 1978 before he ever—" She stopped. "We think he intended to restore it. There are notes in his personal ledger, references to the British project. But he got sick and it never happened." Ethan looked at the wall of his office. He thought about Victoria saying he loved those, talking about the climate-controlled cars, the ones her grandfather had talked about. He thought about the one that was never talked about, under the tarp in the back. "Does Victoria know yet?" he said. "We haven't contacted her. I wanted to tell you first." "I'll call her," Ethan said. "Today." "Ethan," Margaret's voice had a careful quality, "this changes the story significantly. In terms of, her grandfather knew. He chose not to disclose. That's going to be a complicated thing for her family." "I know," Ethan said. "How do you want to handle it?" He thought about it. He thought about the email she'd sent before Patricia saw the draft. He thought about the 3 sentences and the revised paragraph. "Carefully," he said, "and directly. The same as everything else." He called her at 3. She picked up herself, no assistant, which was happening more often now. He told her what Margaret had found. He told her about Thomas Arden and the Surrey sale and the documented purchase and the notation in her grandfather's personal ledger. He told her all of it without softening it, because that was the only way. When he finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "He knew," Victoria said finally. "It appears so," Ethan said. Another silence. "Why didn't he—" She stopped. "He had it for 5 years before he got sick." "Sometimes people intend to do something and run out of time," Ethan said. "That's very generous," she said. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not grief exactly, but adjacent to it. The specific feeling of finding out something about someone who can't explain themselves anymore. "I'm not trying to be generous," Ethan said. "I don't know why he didn't disclose it. Neither do you. The documentation tells us what he did, not why." "No," she said quietly. He let her have the silence. "Thank you for telling me yourself," she said at last. "Of course," Ethan said. After they hung up, he sat with the afternoon quiet of the office for a moment. The shop sounds came through the wall. Danny's radio, the air compressor, the specific clang of a tool on concrete that happened at least once a day in every shop and always sounded worse than it was. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a regular afternoon in a regular place where real work happened. He picked up his sandwich and finished it. The week after Margaret's call had a different weight to it than the weeks before. The earlier weeks had been about containment, keeping the information close, managing who knew what and when, staying ahead of the story long enough to document it properly. That work was mostly done now. The authentication was complete, the provenance was established, The specialists had filed their reports, and the insurance company had its valuation, and the conservation lab in Coventry was finishing with the notebook pages. The containment phase was over. What came next was something Ethan had less experience with and less natural aptitude for, which was the public version of all of it. The joint statement went out on a Friday morning, reviewed and approved by both Patricia and Victoria's communications team after 2 rounds of revisions that were more substantive than Ethan had expected. The final version was accurate and measured and described the discovery in language that satisfied the specialist community without being too technical for a general audience. It named Ethan first, which Victoria's team had suggested, and which he'd assumed would require an argument but didn't. It described his expertise without overselling it. It acknowledged the Langford Foundation's cooperation in the authentication process. It did not mention the gala in specific terms, referring instead to the vehicle's transfer, which was a diplomatic construction that Patricia had proposed, and which everyone accepted because the alternative was more complicated than anyone needed. The response was immediate and substantially larger than Ethan had anticipated, which probably meant he had miscalculated how much attention the story would draw. By noon on Friday, the statement had been covered by 11 automotive and heritage publications, 4 national news outlets, 2 wire services, and a handful of international organizations that he hadn't expected to be following the story. By the following Monday, requests for comment had come in from publications in the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, which was where the Coachwork historian connection made the story internationally resonant in ways the American coverage didn't fully understand. His phone did not stop. He kept it on silent with the screen face down and checked it at scheduled intervals, which Patricia had suggested and which he'd initially dismissed as excessive and had since adopted completely. Danny answered the shop line and had gotten very good at a specific response. Mr. Mercer isn't available for interviews at this time. You're welcome to contact his representative. He delivered this with a professional flatness that Ethan found quietly impressive, given that 3 weeks ago Danny had been a 24-year-old mechanic who occasionally forgot to torque wheel bolts to spec. You're good at that, Ethan told him on the 3rd day. I practiced, Danny said. At home? In the bathroom mirror. He said it without apparent embarrassment, which was its own kind of impressive. The specialist community's response was different from the press coverage in the way that mattered. It was slower, more considered, and more genuine. Ethan received letters, actual physical letters, from 3 people he'd worked with or studied under years ago, before Sarah got sick, before he'd stepped back from the professional world and narrowed his life to Millbrook and the shop and raising Sophie. One was from a curator he'd collaborated with on a documentation project in 2007. One was from a man who had been a mentor of sorts in the early years, a retired restoration expert named Howard Bassett, who was now in his late 70s and lived in Vermont and wrote his letters longhand on actual stationery. One was from a woman who ran the Automotive library at a university in Michigan and who Ethan had met once, briefly, at a symposium, and who wrote to say that she had used his 2011 paper on coachwork identification methodology in her graduate seminar for 4 years, and that this discovery was the practical culmination of everything that paper argued was possible. He read Howard Bassett's letter twice. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it said what it said without excess or performance. The final paragraph was, "You stepped away when you had to. That was right. What you've done here proves that the knowledge doesn't leave just because the room does. I'm glad you found your way back to it." He put the letter in the kitchen drawer where he kept things he wanted to keep. Sophie saw most of the coverage in the way that 9-year-olds encountered news now, through other people's phones and conversations rather than directly seeking it out. She came home one afternoon with a quality of suppressed excitement that she was visibly trying to manage into something more appropriate. "What?" Ethan said. "Nothing," she said. "Sophie." She set her backpack down with more care than usual. "Lily's mom said you're going to be in a magazine." "Probably," he said. "A big one." "I don't know which ones yet." She was quiet for a moment, organizing something internally. "Are people going to come here? Like, to Millbrook?" "Maybe some. Not many." "To the shop?" "Possibly." She chewed her lip. "Is that okay? Like, is that going to be weird for you?" He looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old and was asking whether the attention was going to be okay for him, rather than whether it was going to be interesting or exciting or any of the things a 9-year-old might reasonably focus on. "I'm going to be fine," he said. "It's going to be a little strange for a while, and then it'll settle down. Things always do." She nodded, accepting this. Then, "Can I tell people at school that you knew from the keys?" "You can tell people whatever you want," he said. "Ms. Adiemi asked me about it today. She said it was remarkable. I said I thought so too, but that you probably wouldn't say that." "She's right," Ethan said. "I probably wouldn't." "Because you're modest." "Because I don't know that remarkable is the right word. I just knew what I was looking at." Sophie gave him the look she'd developed sometime in the last year that meant she found him simultaneously correct and insufficient in his self-assessment. It was a look she had inherited from Sarah with such precision that it sometimes stopped him cold. "That's the remarkable part," she said, with the patient clarity of someone explaining something obvious, and went to change out of her school clothes. The conversation with Victoria that mattered most happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the statement went out, and it happened not in a hotel conference room or over the phone, but in person, at the Westfield estate, because Victoria had asked if he would come to see the car one more time before it was transferred to the climate-controlled facility that had been arranged for it in the city. Ethan drove up on a gray December morning with a sky that was considering snow and hadn't decided yet. Gerald met him at the gate, as he always did, and led him across the property to the carriage house. The building had been secured properly now. New lock on the main door, the interior tidied, the work lamp repositioned to give better light. The canvas tarp had been replaced with an archival cover, the breathable kind that proper storage required. The car sat under it in the far corner, the same way it always had, but the corner itself was different. Cleared, clean, attended to. Victoria was already there when he arrived. She was standing near the front of the car with her arms crossed loosely across her chest, not the defensive version of that posture, but the thoughtful one, looking at the archival cover. She was dressed for the weather in a way that was noticeably less curated than the gala or the hotel meeting. Dark coat, practical boots, her hair pulled back without the careful arrangement he'd seen before. She looked, he thought, more like herself. Whatever that meant. He was still working out who she actually was, in the same way he suspected she was still working out some version of that question. "Thank you for coming," she said when he entered. "Of course," he said. Gerald made himself absent with the tact of long practice. They were alone in the carriage house with the gray morning light coming through the high windows and the particular stillness that large, quiet spaces hold. "I wanted to see it one more time before it goes," Victoria said. She looked at the car under its cover. "Before it becomes whatever it's going to become. An exhibit, an auction lot, something with a placard." "It might not be an auction lot," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "That's still undecided." She paused. "Can we look at it?" He moved to the front of the car and folded the archival cover back carefully, the way he always did. Not quickly, not carelessly. The front of the car emerged from the cover in the gray light, the rust and the damage and the decades of neglect all still there, unchanged, because nothing about the physical reality of it had changed. The authentication hadn't fixed anything. It had only established the truth of what was already there. Victoria looked at it for a long time. "My grandfather was a careful man," she said finally. "Not secretive exactly, but private. He kept things to himself." She glanced at Ethan. "I've been thinking about why he didn't disclose the purchase. I've come up with a few theories." "You don't have to share them," Ethan said. "I want to." She looked back at the car. "I think he bought it knowing what it was, knowing it had effectively been lost from public record, and I think he intended to restore it and present it properly when it was done. I think he had plans for it that he never got to execute." She paused. "And I think that when he got sick, he didn't have the energy to deal with it. And then he was gone, and nobody else knew enough to know what they had." "That's probably close to accurate," Ethan said. "He would have been—" She stopped. "He would have hated that it ended up like this. In the back, under a tarp, used as a joke." Her voice on the last two words had something controlled in it. "That part I'm genuinely sorry for, not just to you, to him." Ethan looked at the front of the car, the hood line, the swage line, the long tapered shape of the fender that had told him what he was looking at before he'd fully let himself believe it. "It's here," he said. "That's the thing. It ended up lost, but it also ended up found, which means, in a practical sense, your grandfather's intention to have it properly identified and preserved, that's happening just 50 years later than he planned." She looked at him. "You're very good at finding the version of things that isn't terrible." "No," he said. "I'm good at finding the accurate version. Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment, then she said in a different register, less careful, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," he said. "Your wife." She paused. "I did some background research before the hotel meeting. I know you stepped away from your career when she died. I know you've been running the shop and raising your daughter since then." She looked at him directly. "This discovery is going to change things for you professionally, whether you want it to or not. People are already calling institutions. There was a piece in the European Heritage Automotive Journal that described you as one of the most significant identification experts currently working in the field." "I read it," Ethan said. "Does that feel strange?" He thought about it honestly. "A little," he said. "I've been in the shop for 6 years. That becomes its own kind of normal." "Are you going to go back to the bigger work?" He was quiet for a moment. The carriage house held its particular silence, not empty exactly, but held like a breath before something. "I don't know," he said. "I have a daughter in school. I have a shop and an employee and regular customers who depend on having somewhere to take their cars. Going back to the kind of work I was doing before would mean," he paused, "structural changes. It's not a decision I'm going to make because of the attention from this." "But the knowledge is still there," she said. "That's what this proved." "The knowledge was always there," Ethan said. "The knowledge doesn't care whether I'm using it or not." She smiled at that, a small, real one, the kind that wasn't assembled for a room. He'd seen versions of her public smile many times now. This was something else. "I want to make a proposal," she said, "formally, through Patricia and Harrison, so everything's documented. But I wanted to talk to you about it first." She uncrossed her arms and put her hands in her coat pockets. "I'm not going to contest ownership. That's the baseline. The car is yours, legally and morally, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Okay," Ethan said, "but I'd like to propose a partnership on what happens next. Not ownership. You'd maintain full legal title. But the foundation has resources and relationships with institutions that could be valuable in terms of how this car is preserved and presented. We have a relationship with a museum in Boston that has the right facilities. We have connections with the authentication community through our arts programs." She paused. "And I'd like to fund the restoration." Ethan was quiet. "Not to take anything from you," she said quickly, "and not to put the Langford name on it in some way that overshadows the history. The restoration would be done by whoever you think is the right person, under your direction, with full documentation of the process. The foundation would cover costs. In return, and this is the part Harrison insisted I include, we'd ask for right of first exhibition. 1 year in the Boston Museum, properly presented before any other disposition of the vehicle." He looked at the car. He thought about what restoration meant for this particular vehicle. The engine that needed to be found or rebuilt, the bodywork that needed to be treated, the interior that would have to be researched and sourced. The work that would take years, done by someone who understood what it was and what it deserved. The work that he himself was probably the most qualified person in the country to direct. "Who does the restoration?" he said. "You choose." "And the documentation process?" "Fully open. Margaret Okafor's team, Robert Dillard, Francis Elroy, whoever you think should be involved. Full transparency." "I want approval on the exhibition design," he said. "Not artistic approval, but I don't care about the lighting, but the interpretive content, what it says about the car, its history, how it was found. All of that gets my sign-off." "Agreed," she said, without hesitation. "And the notebook," he said. "The contents stay in Coventry's archive, publicly accessible. The foundation will make a donation to the Coventry Archive to support their conservation work," she said, "as part of this." He looked at the car for another moment. The rust, the empty engine bay, the perished tires. All of the damage and neglect and time, sitting there honestly, not pretending to be anything other than what it was. I'll talk to Patricia, he said, and I'll want to see the formal proposal before I agree to anything. Of course, she said, but, he paused. In principle. In principle, this is probably the right way to handle it. Something in her posture released slightly. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the physical equivalent of a breath let out. Good, she said. That's good. They stood in silence for a moment, both of them looking at the car. The gray light had shifted slightly, the morning moving on, the sky outside the high windows having made its decision about snow and apparently chosen to wait. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Yes? The gala, the setup with the keys and the spotlight. He looked at her. Was it your idea? The whole presentation. She held his gaze. Yes. Not your communications team. It was my idea. They helped execute it. She paused. I thought it would be funny, self-deprecating. Look at this worthless thing in my grandfather's collection. I didn't think about the person who would be standing there receiving it. You thought about the room, Ethan said, not the individual. She was quiet for a moment. That's accurate, she said, and it's something I've thought about a lot since. She looked at the car. I run a company. I speak to groups. I make decisions that affect a lot of people, and I'm very comfortable thinking at that scale. Individual people in specific situations. She stopped. I'm less practiced at that. Most people at your level are, Ethan said. It wasn't an excuse. It was just true. That's not particularly comforting, she said. It's not meant to be. But it's where change starts. Noticing the gap. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. You're a strange person to be having this conversation with, she said. Because I was the one in the spotlight? Because you have every reason to be angry, and you're not. He thought about that. I was, a little, he said, for about the first half hour after the gala, in the parking lot of the hotel, walking to my truck. He paused. And then I looked at the keys and I stopped being angry and started being interested, which is how it usually goes for me. She laughed at that. A short, genuine sound surprised out of her. It changed her face completely. They covered the car again with the archival cloth, together, each taking one side and drawing it over carefully. It was a small, practical thing, the kind of task that required attention and made conversation feel easier. And Ethan thought it was probably the first time he and Victoria Langford had done anything together that was just a task. Not a negotiation, not a conversation with stakes, just two people making sure something was properly covered. When does the transfer happen? He asked. Next week, if the facility is ready. They're confirming Thursday. I'd like to be there, he said. I was hoping you would, she said. He left the estate at 11:30 and drove back toward Millbrook in the light that had gotten clearer as the morning went on. The snow still not arriving, the sky a pale winter white over the fields. He thought about the proposal. He thought about restoration, the actual work of it, the sourcing and the research and the careful physical process of taking something broken and making it functional again without destroying what it had been. It was work he hadn't done at that level in years. He wasn't sure he was still fast enough at it, still current enough in his sources and contacts. He would be slower than he would have been 10 years ago. He would make mistakes that a younger version of himself wouldn't have made, but the knowledge was still there. He called Patricia from the truck, hands-free, somewhere between Westfield and Millbrook. He told her about the proposal. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to things that required her full attention rather than reactive management. The foundation covers restoration costs, she said when he finished, and you retain title. Yes. Right of first exhibition, 1 year. 1 year. Your sign-off on the interpretive content. Yes. And she agreed to all of this in conversation, without Harrison in the room. Yes. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Ethan, that's a better arrangement than I would have gotten for you in negotiation. I know, he said. She's either genuinely contrite or very strategically generous. Probably both, Ethan said. People are usually both. Another pause. I'll need to see the formal documents before anything is signed, and I want a clause about the exhibition content review that has teeth, not just approval in principle, but a defined timeline and a defined process. Fine, he said. And the restoration team needs to be specified. You need contractual control over that. I know, Patricia. I know, he said. I'll send you the term sheet when it comes. He hung up. The road went on in the way roads went on in December in that part of the country. Bare trees, gray fields, the particular flatness of a landscape that had let go of its color for the season. He passed a farm stand that was closed for winter, a gas station, a church with a sign out front that he didn't read. He drove through the town where Sophie's school was and thought about picking her up in a few hours and what to make for dinner. The formal proposal from Harrison's office arrived 3 days later, and it was thorough and careful and largely aligned with what Victoria had described in the carriage house. Patricia went through it with the systematic attention of someone who enjoyed finding gaps in legal documents, and she found 4 things that needed clarification and 2 things that needed stronger language, and she sent a revised version back with notes. Harrison responded within 24 hours, which Patricia said was fast and indicated a genuine desire to close. 2 more rounds of revisions, then a final version that both parties accepted. Ethan signed on a Tuesday afternoon. Patricia had the papers couriered to the shop, which struck him as more dramatic than necessary, but he understood that people who dealt in legal documents had a relationship to the physical reality of signatures that he didn't share. He signed where Patricia had marked, initialed where she'd marked, and couriered the papers back. That night he told Sophie. Not the legal details. She didn't need those. He told her the shape of it, that the car was going to be restored and properly preserved, and that he was going to be involved in directing that work, and that it would be in a museum eventually where people could see it. Sophie listened to all of this at the kitchen table over the remains of dinner, with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was actually interested in. "The museum in Boston," she said. "Can we go?" "When it opens," Ethan said. "Yes." "Will your name be on it, like at the museum?" He hadn't thought specifically about that. "Somewhere in the documentation, probably." "On the placard?" she pressed. "I don't know yet." She considered this. "It should be," she said, "because you're the one who found it. Other people helped. But you knew first, from the keys." She said it with a matter-of-fact pride that was completely unself-conscious. "That should be on the placard." He looked at his daughter. He thought about all the ways a person could know something, the years it took to build that kind of knowledge, the specific accumulation of attention and work and time that made recognition possible. He thought about standing in the gala spotlight with the leather fob in his hand and the room's laughter still in the air, and looking at those keys and knowing, in the first solid, quiet part of himself, that the noise of the room couldn't reach what he was looking at. "We'll see," he said. Sophie's expression indicated that she considered this a non-answer but was choosing to accept it for now. She started clearing plates. The transfer of the vehicle happened on a Friday in the second week of December, in the early morning before the traffic built. Ethan was there by 7, which meant he'd left Millbrook at 6:15 in the dark, which meant he'd set his alarm for 5:45 and lain awake for 20 minutes before it went off. He'd stopped at the gas station for coffee because his coffee maker had been making a grinding sound for 3 days that he kept meaning to address and hadn't. The transport team was from a company that specialized in moving high-value vehicles. 4 people, a custom enclosed trailer, equipment for loading a vehicle with no engine and compromised suspension, and the kind of professional quietness that came from doing careful work carefully. Ethan watched them work and offered information when they asked for it, which wasn't often because they were good. Gerald was there. Victoria arrived at 7:45, which Ethan noted was earlier than he'd expected. She stood with him near the carriage house door and watched the loading process with the same focused attention she'd shown looking at the car itself. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Fine," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "That's your standard answer." "It's usually accurate," he said. "And right now?" He thought about it. Outside the carriage house, past the estate gate, past the fields and the bare trees and the winter morning, the world was going about its business with no awareness that a car was being moved from one place to another. that the resolution of a 52-year question was happening in a quiet way in a property in Westfield, that a man who had spent 6 years in a small-town shop was standing here watching something he'd found and identified and fought for. Not dramatically, not loudly, but fought for in the way that mattered, with knowledge and patience and the steady refusal to let the thing be less than it was. "I feel like it's going somewhere it should have gone a long time ago," he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "So do I," she said. The car went up the ramp and into the enclosed trailer with the slow, careful progress that the situation required. The transport team secured it with the professionalism that Ethan had been watching and approving of for the last hour. The trailer doors closed. The team lead handed Ethan a custody receipt and a GPS tracking number, which struck him as both very modern and exactly right. Gerald shook his hand. Victoria shook his hand and then seemed to decide something and said, "When the restoration is complete, whenever that is, I'd like to see it, if that's acceptable." "Of course," Ethan said, "and I'd like to—" She paused. "I want to stay involved in the right way, not as an owner or a decision maker, but as someone who—" She stopped again, which was unusual for her. "My grandfather would have wanted to see this done right. I'd like to be part of doing it right, in whatever capacity is appropriate." Ethan looked at her for a moment. He thought about the carriage house and the hotel conference room and the phone calls and the draft statement with the revised paragraph. He thought about a woman who had made a mistake in front of 200 people and then spent the subsequent weeks choosing, repeatedly, to handle the consequences of that mistake with a straightforwardness that he hadn't expected and that had made everything easier than it might have been. People surprised you. Not always. Not reliably. But sometimes. "I'll be in touch about the restoration timeline, Sertan," he said. "Margaret is going to want to be involved in the planning stages, and I'd like you both in the room for that conversation." She nodded. "Thank you," she said. And again, like on the phone weeks earlier, he had the sense that she meant it in the larger way, not just the transactional way. The trailer pulled out of the estate drive at 8:53. Ethan stood in the gate and watched it go, the white enclosed trailer moving down the road until it rounded the curve and disappeared behind the tree line. He stood there for another moment. The carriage house behind him was empty now in a way it hadn't been before. Not just the absence of the car, but the absence of what the car had represented, the held question, the long incompletion. That was gone now, moving down a road in a climate-controlled trailer toward a facility that would hold it safely while the work was planned. He drove back to Millbrook. He stopped at the coffee shop on Main Street that he passed every day and occasionally went into and ordered a coffee that was better than the gas station version had been. He sat at the counter for a few minutes while he drank it, not looking at his phone, just sitting. The woman behind the counter, whose name was Janet and who had worked there as long as Ethan had been coming in, said, "You look like someone who just finished something big." "Getting there," Ethan said. She refilled his coffee without being asked. "My nephew showed me that article," she said. "The car thing." "Yeah," he said. "Pretty remarkable." He thought about Sophie saying that's the remarkable part, in her patient explaining voice. He thought about what it meant to hold knowledge for a long time without it being recognized, and what it felt like when recognition finally arrived. Not the explosion he might have imagined, but something quieter, something more like a door opening into a room that had been there all along. "It was a good car," he said. "It deserved to be found." Janet nodded like that was the right kind of answer. He finished his coffee and left a tip that was probably too large and walked out into the December morning and drove to his shop, where Danny was already there, and the Camry from the week before had come back with a new noise that nobody had asked for, and there was work to do, the ordinary specific work of a Tuesday in December, and he did it. The restoration planning meeting happened in the second week of January in a conference room at the Boston facility where the car was now being held, and it was the first time that Ethan, Margaret Okafor, Robert Dillard, Francis Elroy, and Victoria Langford had all been in the same room at the same time. Ethan had thought about this gathering in the weeks leading up to it, the specific combination of people and what it represented, the different angles from which each of them had come to this moment. Francis had spent 30 years writing about cars like this one. Margaret had spent 20 years preserving the documents that proved they had existed, Robert had spent his career authenticating the ones that surfaced, rarely, in conditions never quite as dramatic as this. Victoria had spent the last 3 months learning, in a way that seemed genuine and occasionally uncomfortable for her, that she had been standing next to something extraordinary for her entire life, without knowing it. And Ethan had spent 6 years in a small shop in Millbrook, and 15 years before that building, the knowledge that a single evening had finally required him to use. The facility itself was serious in the way that proper preservation facilities were serious, climate-controlled to within narrow tolerances, staffed by people who treated every vehicle as if it were irreplaceable, which in this case was literally true. The car had been placed in a dedicated bay with appropriate support structures under the frame and the kind of lighting that allowed detailed examination without risk. The archival cover had been replaced with something even more carefully designed. When Ethan walked in on the morning of the meeting and saw it there, properly supported, properly lit, properly held, he felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't known was still unsettled. Robert arrived first, then Frances, then Margaret, then Victoria, with Harrison, who sat at the far end of the table and mostly listened. The meeting ran 4 hours, which was longer than anyone had planned and shorter than the material probably warranted. They discussed the restoration philosophy first, which was the foundational question: how much and in what direction? There were 2 schools of thought in high-level historic vehicle restoration, and they were genuinely incompatible in their underlying logic. The first held that a vehicle should be returned to its original specification as completely as possible, using period-correct materials and methods, prioritizing authenticity over everything. The second held that the evidence of time was itself part of the historical record, and that aggressive restoration destroyed information as much as it preserved it, and that the right approach was conservation, stabilization, documentation, minimal intervention. "She's not a museum piece," Frances said, which was how he referred to the car, and had apparently always done so, because for him these vehicles were not its but her, a distinction he made without apology. She was built to be driven. The builder's intention was kinetic. If we stabilize her and put her behind glass, we're honoring the artifact at the expense of the intention. "The artifact is what we have," Margaret said, patient and firm in the way she always was when she disagreed with Frances, which Ethan gathered was a recurring dynamic in their professional relationship. "The intention is historical. The physical object is present. Our obligation is to the object. Our obligation is to the complete truth of what she was," Frances said. "We can't drive her in 1959 again," Margaret said. "That's gone. The object is not." They went around this several times. Ethan listened to both of them without interrupting, which was harder than it looked because he had opinions, but the opinions needed to wait until he understood the full range of the argument as it existed in the room. Robert said, "Ethan, you've been quiet." Everyone looked at him. He had been thinking about what Victoria had said in the carriage house, about her grandfather, about the intention that had never been executed, about a man who had bought this car knowing what it was and died before he could do what he'd planned with it. He'd been thinking about that off and on for weeks. It had a specific weight to it that he kept returning to. "Both positions are correct," Ethan said, "which means neither of them is sufficient on its own." He paused, organizing it. "The car needs to be stabilized and documented fully before anything else happens. That's not a philosophical position. It's a practical one. We need to know exactly what we have before we decide what to do with it. Full photographic record, material analysis, condition survey, everything." He looked at Margaret. "That's your work, and it needs to be done first, regardless of what comes after." Margaret nodded. "After that," he said, "the question of how far to restore depends on what we find. If the original engine can be located or accurately reproduced, if the mechanical systems can be brought to operational condition without significant compromise to the historical material." He paused. "Then I think Frances is right that the builder's intention matters. This car was meant to run. It should run." "The engine has been missing for 50 years, Robert said. "I know," Ethan said. "I have some leads." Everyone looked at him again in a slightly different way this time. "The notebook," he said. "The builder's specifications are detailed enough to identify the specific unit. There were only 4 engines of that type produced for private commission in that period. One was destroyed. One is in a collection in the Netherlands that I've already contacted. One is unaccounted for, and one, he paused because the research had taken him to a place he hadn't expected, and he was still somewhat astonished by it. One is in a private collection in upstate New York, owned by a man named Gerald Thatch, who bought it at an estate sale in 1991 without knowing what it was and has had it on a shelf in his garage for 33 years. The room was quiet. "You found the engine," Victoria said. "Possibly," Ethan said. "I need to see it in person to be certain, but the documentation matches." Francis made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated everything. "When did you find this?" Robert said. 3 weeks ago, Ethan said. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Thatch. He's willing to sell if it's confirmed to be what I think it is." He looked around the table. "That's the restoration path. If the engine is right, we have a mechanical foundation. From there, it's a 2 to 3 year project, depending on what the condition survey shows. 2 to 3 years. He said it simply, as a fact, the way he stated all facts about work. But in the room, there was a pause around those words that acknowledged what they meant. Not just the time, but the commitment, the full weight of what he was proposing to take on. "Who does the work?" Victoria asked. "I do," Ethan said, "with a team. I know 2 restoration specialists who have the right skills for this level of coach work. I'll bring them in for the bodywork and the interior. The mechanical systems I'll handle myself, with oversight from Robert when we get to the engine." "You're going to do this from Millbrook," Victoria said. It wasn't skeptical, just clarifying. "I'm going to do this from here," he said. "The car stays in this facility. I travel." He paused. "I'll need to restructure the shop. Danny can handle the day-to-day with a part-time addition. It's manageable." He'd worked all of this out over the previous weeks, in the evenings after Sophie was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with notebooks and schedules, and the specific math of what was possible versus what he wanted to be possible. He'd called Danny in 2 days ago and told him the shape of what was coming. Danny had listened and then said, "So you're doing the real work again," which was not how Ethan would have characterized the distinction, but which he understood. "The shop work is real work," Ethan had said. "Yeah," Danny said, "but this is," he gestured vaguely. "Different," Ethan said. "Yeah," Danny said again. He'd given Danny a raise and told him to start looking for a reliable part-time person, someone with basic mechanical competence and the temperament to handle customers without Ethan present. Danny had approached this task with a seriousness that Ethan found both touching and appropriate. The planning meeting ended at 2 in the afternoon with a timeline agreed upon and a set of next steps that everyone understood and accepted. Margaret would lead the documentation phase, starting within 2 weeks. Ethan would visit Gerald Thatch in upstate New York the following weekend to examine the possible engine. Francis would prepare a formal restoration philosophy document that would serve as the governing framework for all decisions going forward. Harrison would handle the legal structure of the partnership arrangement, which was already mostly in place but needed a few additional provisions now that the scope was clear. Victoria stayed after the others had begun gathering their things. She stood near the car and looked at it, the same way she'd stood in the carriage house in December. Not studying it exactly, but present with it, thinking something she hadn't said yet. 3 years, she said to Ethan. "Give or take," he said, "and at the end of that she runs." "That's the goal," he said. She nodded slowly. "My grandfather would have done this in 5, she said. "He was thorough to a fault. His estate manager used to say he measured twice and cut once, which sounds like a compliment but was actually a complaint about his pace." She smiled, briefly. "I think he would have liked you." "I think he would have driven this car too hard," Ethan said. She laughed, the short, genuine kind that he'd heard a few times now, and that was so different from her public version. "Yes," she said. "Probably." He drove back to Millbrook that evening in the particular tired but clear state that followed a day of sustained, careful thinking. He picked Sophie up from Mrs. Papadopoulos's at 6:30, which was later than usual, and Sophie had eaten already, which meant he didn't have to make dinner, which he hadn't been looking forward to. "How was it?" Sophie said in the truck. "Good," he said. "Productive." "Are you going to fix the car now?" "Start planning to. It'll take a while to actually fix it." "How long?" 2 or 3 years. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time." "It's a complicated car," he said. "But you'll do it?" Yes, he said. I'll do it. She seemed to be sitting with something. He waited because Sophie usually got there on her own if you gave her the space to. Are you going to be away more? She said. Like, for the car? There it was. He'd been expecting this question and had thought about how to answer it honestly. Some, he said. The car is going to be in Boston. I'll have to go there regularly, but I'm not moving. I'm here. I'll arrange my schedule so I'm home most nights. Most? She said, with the precision of someone who had noticed the hedge. Almost all, he said. There might be some nights here and there. We'll work it out with Mrs. Papadopoulos. She looked out the window at the dark December street. Okay, she said. Are you okay with it? I don't know yet, she said, which was the most honest answer she could have given. I'll tell you when I do. Fair enough, he said. She was quiet for a moment more, then, is it important? The car. Like, to you specifically, not just to the history people. He thought about the keys in his palm at the gala. He thought about the hood line in the carriage house and the swage line and the weld work under the flashlight. He thought about lying on the cold concrete under the frame and knowing, in the specific wordless way that knowledge sometimes arrived, that he was looking at something that deserved to be found. Yes, he said, it's important to me specifically. Then it's okay, she said, in the tone of someone who had made a decision and moved on. She turned the radio on to the station she liked, which played a mixture of things that Ethan didn't entirely follow, and they drove home. The trip to see Gerald Thatch happened on a Saturday, 6 days later, and Ethan drove 2 hours north in January cold, past frozen fields and the kind of upstate landscape that looked like a different country from the coast. Gerald Thatch was 73 years old and lived on a property that had been in his family for 4 generations and had a garage that was, in the particular way of people who had accumulated a lifetime of mechanical interest, somewhere between organized and archaeological. Gerald met him in the driveway. He was a compact man, deliberate in his movements, with the quality of someone who had worked with his hands for 50 years and was entirely comfortable with silence. He led Ethan into the garage without much preamble. The engine was on a metal shelf at the back, wrapped in old cloth. Gerald unwrapped it without ceremony and stepped back. Ethan stood in front of it for a while. He had done his research. He had the specifications from the notebook and the cross-reference documentation from the builder's records that Margaret's team had compiled. He knew what he was looking for, the specific casting marks, the unique modification that this builder had made to the carburation setup on commission pieces, the particular configuration of the valve covers. He looked at all of it systematically, which took 40 minutes, and he asked Gerald a few questions about the estate sale, where he'd acquired it, and the storage conditions since then. Gerald answered in the measured way he did everything. He'd bought it because it looked interesting and the price was right, and he had room on the shelf. He hadn't known what it was. He'd shown it to a mechanic friend once who hadn't known either. It had sat there for 33 years waiting for someone to come along who knew what to look for. Is it what you thought it was? Gerald said when Ethan had been quiet for long enough. Yes, Ethan said. Gerald nodded. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded, the way a man nodded when something had been confirmed that he'd half suspected but hadn't wanted to assume. They settled on a price that was fair to both of them. Significantly more than Gerald had paid in 1991, significantly less than what the engine's place in the complete car would eventually represent in valuation terms, and right for what the transaction actually was. One careful person recognizing another and deciding that the thing should go to where it was needed. Ethan loaded the engine into the back of his truck with the same care he would have used if it were made of glass, which it wasn't. But the decades of good storage had made it fragile in certain ways that needed respect. He drove back south through the January afternoon with the engine behind him and thought about the distance things traveled before they found where they belonged. He called Robert from the road. Found it, he said. You're sure? Robert said. Completely. A pause. Ethan, Robert said, and then stopped. I know, Ethan said. No, I mean, Robert paused again. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen significant finds. I've been part of some of them. But the complete picture here, the car, the notebook, the provenance, and now the engine, all of it coming together around one person who knew enough to see all of it. He stopped. That doesn't happen. It happened slowly, Ethan said. 6 months. It just looks fast from the outside. That's not what I mean, Robert said. I mean the knowledge. The specific intersection of everything you happen to know. That's not common, Ethan. That's not something you develop in a few years. That's a lifetime of paying the right kind of attention. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The road went on. The engine was behind him in the truck, wrapped in moving blankets he'd brought for exactly this purpose. I had a good teacher, he said, and then I had a lot of time alone in a shop to think about what I'd learned. That's underselling it. Maybe, he said, but it's accurate. The engine went to the Boston facility the following week, documented and secured alongside the car, and the official start of the restoration planning phase was logged in the project records that the facility maintained. Margaret's documentation team was scheduled to begin in February. Everything was moving. The press attention had not gone away, but it had changed character. The initial wave of the dramatic discovery story, the gala angle, the single father, and the billionaire had crested and receded, as those waves did, replaced by something slower and more specific. The automotive heritage publications were running longer pieces, analytical rather than narrative, about the implications of the find for how lost vehicles should be tracked and documented. 2 universities had reached out about Ethan's methodology, asking if he would consider giving a lecture or participating in a symposium. The European Heritage Automotive Journal had commissioned a feature piece that Francis Elroy was writing, and Francis had called Ethan 4 times with questions that were increasingly about Ethan's process and increasingly less about the car, which Ethan had mixed feelings about. You don't like being the subject, Margaret said when he mentioned this to her. I don't mind, he said. I just don't think the subject is the interesting part. The car is the interesting part, she said. The knowledge is the interesting part, he said. How it accumulates, how it gets recognized. What happens when nobody around you has the same frame of reference? He paused. The car is just the occasion. Margaret looked at him for a moment with the specific expression she got when she was processing something and deciding how to respond. You should write that down, she said. I'm not a writer. You don't need to be a writer to document your own methodology, she said. You need to be precise and honest. You're both of those things. She paused. The Coventry Archive has a publication series for identification methodology. Would you consider a paper? He hadn't considered it. He thought about the 2011 paper that the Michigan librarian had mentioned in her letter, the one she'd used in her graduate seminar for 4 years. He'd written that paper in 6 weeks, in the evenings, on a laptop at the kitchen table while Sophie slept, because the ideas had been there, and the act of writing them down had felt like the right thing to do with them. He hadn't expected anyone to read it. He'd sent it to Margaret's predecessor at Coventry and more or less forgotten about it. I'll think about it, he said. That's a yes, Margaret said. It's an I'll think about it, he said. From you, that's a yes, she said, with the confidence of someone who had known him long enough to have a basis for the distinction. She was right, as it turned out. He started writing in March in the evenings, on the same laptop, at the same kitchen table. The paper was about identification methodology, about what it meant to read physical evidence accurately, about how knowledge accumulated in fields that most people never looked at closely. He wrote about the specific nature of attention, the difference between looking at something and seeing it, the way that years of practice changed the quality of perception itself. He wrote about the gala, without naming it, as a case study in what happened when specialized knowledge met uninformed assumption. He tried to write honestly about what he knew and how he knew it and what it had taken to develop, without making himself the hero of his own methodology, which was a balance he found genuinely difficult. Sophie caught him writing one night, which happened more and more because she had a habit of appearing in the kitchen at 9 or 9:30, claiming thirst, when she was actually checking on him. What are you writing? She said. A paper, he said. Like a school paper? Sort of, for a journal. She got her water and stood at the counter drinking it, looking at him with the considering expression she got when she was deciding whether to ask something. Is it about the car? Partly, he said. Mostly it's about how to know things. She thought about this. How to know things you've learned or how to know things in general? How to know things you've learned, he said, and how to trust that knowledge when nobody around you can verify it. She put her glass down. That sounds like it's also about you. A little, he admitted. Is that okay, writing about yourself? I'm trying to make it useful, he said. Not just personal. She nodded, accepting this. Then, Dad? Yeah. I think it's good that you're doing both things, she said. The shop and the car, not just one or the other. Why? He said. She shrugged, which was her way of indicating that the answer was obvious, and she was slightly surprised he was asking. Because you're better when you have things to figure out, she said. You're more present, like you're actually here. She picked up her glass. Before, sometimes it was like you were here, but also somewhere else. He looked at his daughter in the kitchen light. She was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes and a quality of observation that she hadn't gotten from him or from Sarah so much as from the particular combination of them, the specific thing that happened when two people made a person who was something neither of them had been separately. You're right, he said. I'm sorry about the before times. She shook her head, dismissing the apology without dismissing the acknowledgement. I'm just saying it's better now, she said. That's all. She went back to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after, not writing, just sitting in the quiet house with the heat moving through the vents and the particular stillness of a late evening in March. He thought about what Sophie had said. He thought about the 6 years in the shop, the good parts of it, which were real, the necessary parts of it, which were also real, and the parts that had been hiding, which he was only able to name now that they were over. He had loved the shop work. He still loved it. But there had been something in the narrowing of his life that had been about more than raising Sophie or grieving Sarah. It had been about making himself small enough that nothing could get through to hurt anything important, small enough that the world's capacity for damage couldn't find a target. The car had gotten through anyway. Or rather, the keys on the leather fob had gotten through, in a ballroom he hadn't wanted to attend, on a night he'd almost stayed home from because Sophie had given him an out by suggesting he go, which was the smallest of ironies. Knowledge didn't wait. It just sat there inside you, accumulating and patient, until the moment it was needed. And then it was there, available, the way it had always been, the way all the years of paying attention had always been heading somewhere, even when it felt like they were going nowhere. He thought about the car in its bay in Boston, properly supported, properly lit, held safely while the plans came together. He thought about the engine on the shelf in Gerald Thatch's garage for 33 years, wrapped in cloth, waiting without knowing it was waiting. He thought about the notebook in the conservation lab, its pages read now, its secrets documented, the original client's name written down in a public archive where anyone who wanted to could find it. He thought about Thomas Arden in Surrey in 1959, sitting across from the builder and describing what he wanted, the specific vision he had for a car that would be his, that would carry his intentions and his taste and the particular quality of his attention to beautiful things. Thomas Arden had died in 1969 and never knew that the car he'd commissioned would spend 50 years lost. Edward Langford had bought it, knowing what it was, and died in 1978 before he could do what he'd intended. A lot of time had passed. A lot of people had not gotten to see what they'd wanted to see. But the car was here. The engine was with it now. The notebook was preserved. The knowledge that had allowed all of this to come together was documented and would outlast him, would go into a paper that people he would never meet might read and use and build on. Nothing was wasted. None of the years in the shop, none of the years before, none of the attention paid to things that nobody around him could see the value of. You didn't know, when you were learning something, why you were learning it. You just learned because the thing was worth knowing. And then the years went by, and you were somewhere you hadn't planned to be, holding keys in a ballroom, and you understood that the learning had always been going somewhere. It just hadn't told you where. The restoration took 27 months from the time the documentation phase completed. Not 3 years, which had been the outer estimate, but longer than 2, which had been the optimistic one, and exactly as long as it needed to be, which was the only timeline that had ever mattered. Ethan drove to Boston 114 times during those 27 months, which was a number he knew because he kept the mileage log for tax purposes, and had looked it up one evening with the specific curiosity that came from wondering how much of his life the project had consumed in concrete measurable terms. 114 round trips, roughly 90 miles each way. He knew the route in the way you knew things you did repeatedly, not consciously, but in the body, the turns and the exits, and the particular stretch of highway where the Boston skyline first appeared over the tree line. Danny ran the shop with a part-time assistant named Carla, who had applied for the position with a resume that was thin on formal experience and thick on evident intelligence, and who had turned out to be exactly what the situation required. She was 22 and learned fast and didn't pretend to know things she didn't know, which was the first quality Ethan looked for in anyone who worked with him. Danny had found her and made the recommendation, and Ethan had trusted it, which was its own kind of development, trusting Danny's judgment about something that mattered. The shop was fine without him, not perfect. Things were different when he wasn't there, and some customers noticed and some of them said so. But fine. The work got done. The customers came back. The shop did not collapse in his partial absence, which he had known intellectually, but which required the actual experience of it to fully believe. Victoria came to the facility 4 times during the restoration. Not to observe the work. She'd made clear early on that she wasn't going to be looking over anyone's shoulder, but to see the progress, which was a different thing. Each time she came, she spent 20 minutes with the car and then sat with Ethan in the facility's small conference room and asked questions that had gotten more specific as her knowledge had developed. By the 4th visit, she was asking about the specific alloy in the replacement fasteners, and why the decision had been made to use them rather than period reproductions, which was a question that indicated she had been doing her own reading. "You've been researching," Ethan said. "I had some time," she said, "and I wanted to understand what I was funding." "You understood what you were funding from the beginning," he said. "I understood the value," she said. "That's different from understanding the work." He looked at her for a moment. The Victoria Langford who had stood at the gala podium with her assembled smile and her practiced warmth was still there when the situation called for it. He'd seen her in public context since, and she was still very good at being what a room needed her to be. But there was this version too, the one that showed up in the conference room with specific questions about fastener alloys. And he thought this was probably the version that had always been underneath, waiting for the right context to be useful. "The fasteners," he said, and explained. She listened. She asked a follow-up. He answered. They went on like that for 40 minutes, longer than any of the previous visits, until she had to leave for something else and stood up and put on her coat and said, in the matter-of-fact way she'd adopted for these conversations, "Same time next month?" "I'll be here," he said. The night before the unveiling, Ethan stayed late at the facility. Not working. The work was done. Had been done for 2 weeks, and the days since had been the particular strange waiting period that followed completion, when everything you'd been working toward was finished, and the air around it felt both full and somehow thin. He stayed because he wanted to be alone with it one more time before it became the thing it was about to become. The exhibit, the artifact, the documented historical object with its placard and its provenance notes, and its place in the public record. The car was finished. That was still a strange thing to hold in his mind. Finished, operational. The engine that had spent 33 years on a shelf in Gerald Thatch's garage, now seated in the engine bay where it belonged. The bodywork treated and stabilized with the particular philosophy they'd agreed on, which honored both the original intention and the evidence of time. It was not a perfect car. It bore the marks of what it had been through. But it was whole. And it ran. And the morning after the documentation phase had completed and they'd started the engine for the first time, the sound of it in the quiet facility had made Francis Elroy put both hands flat on the hood and close his eyes, and nobody had said anything for almost a full minute. Ethan sat in a chair near the front of the car in the dark facility, the way he'd sat in Sophie's doorway when she was small and he needed to be close to something that mattered. He looked at the shape of it in the low light, the long hood line, the fender curves, the swage line that had told him everything in a carriage house in Westfield in October a little over 2 years ago. He thought about all the people who had touched this car, Thomas Arden, who had commissioned it and loved it and died not knowing its future. The builder, whose notes in the recovered notebook were careful and proud. the work of someone who understood they were making something lasting. Edward Langford, who had found it and brought it across an ocean and run out of time. The chain of ordinary negligence that had let it sit in a corner for decades. Not malicious, just human, the way things got set aside and forgot themselves. And then the gala and the keys and the ballroom full of people who had looked at the same situation and seen a joke. He didn't hold that against any of them, including Victoria. People saw what they had the equipment to see. He had different equipment, built over a long time at considerable cost, and the cost had included things he would not have chosen to pay. Sarah's illness, the years away from the work he loved, the particular specific loneliness of being a person in a room where nobody shares your frame of reference. That cost was real. But so was what it had purchased. He sat in the quiet facility and looked at the finished car and thought, this was worth knowing, all of it, every year of it, the attention paid and the knowledge built, and the life lived in a way that made this moment possible. Worth it. Not because it led here. He hadn't known it was leading here, and you couldn't live for the outcomes you couldn't see, but because the knowing was the thing. The knowing was always the thing, whether or not it ever found the occasion to be useful. The unveiling was at 2 o'clock on a Saturday in late October, which meant it had been exactly 2 years and 23 days since Ethan had stood in the carriage house in Westfield and lifted the edge of a carelessly thrown tarp and looked at a hood line and known what he was looking at. The facility had arranged a reception in the gallery space adjacent to the car's bay, and the guest list included the specialists who had been part of the authentication and restoration process, representatives from the automotive heritage community, a few journalists from the right publications, and 112 members of the public who had secured tickets through the museum's website the day they went on sale and sold out in 40 minutes. Sophie came. She wore a blue dress that she had selected herself and dark shoes that she would complain about by the end of the evening, and she stood next to Ethan in the receiving line and shook hands with people whose names she'd been hearing for 2 years as though she had been doing this her entire life, which, in a certain sense, she had been. Margaret was there. Robert. Francis, who had aged visibly in the past 2 years and moved more slowly but whose mind was entirely unchanged, which was the most Francis thing possible. Gerald Thatch had made the drive from upstate New York and stood near the engine bay with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done a small right thing and seen it matter. Howard Bassett was there, which Ethan had not expected. He was in his late 70s, and the trip from Vermont in October was not nothing, but he was there, standing at the back of the gallery in his good coat. And when Ethan found him in the crowd, he crossed the room and shook the old man's hand and didn't say much because Howard Bassett was a person who understood that some moments didn't need words added to them. Victoria gave a short speech. It was the best public speaking he'd ever heard from her. Not the polished gala version, but something that seemed to have actually been written by her for this, with the specific quality of something meant. She talked about her grandfather and what he had intended and not gotten to finish. She talked about the 50-year journey of an object that could not speak for itself. She talked about what it meant when knowledge existed in the world and the right person carried it to the right place at the right time. She did not say the word remarkable. She said, "Some people know how to see things that the rest of us can't. We don't always recognize that when we're standing in front of it. I didn't." She paused, and the pause was not calculated. "I'm grateful for the correction." Ethan stood near the back of the gallery while she spoke, Sophie beside him, and he looked at the car, visible now through the open bay doors, properly lit, complete, the placard beside it carrying the text he'd approved and the documentation notes that Margaret's team had compiled, and the acknowledgement of everyone who had contributed to the identification and restoration process, in the order that honesty required. His name was first. Sophie had known it would be. She'd told him weeks ago, when he showed her the draft, that it should be, and she'd been right, and he'd accepted it with the same quiet practicality with which he accepted most things that were accurate. After the speeches, after the official unveiling of the placard and the photograph that every publication present would use, and which Ethan was already dreading slightly, after the reception drinks and the conversations, and the moment when Francis Elroy stood beside the car and placed his hand on the fender with the gentle reverence of someone saying a kind of goodbye to something they had looked for 30 years. After all of that, the crowd thinned, and the gallery began to empty, and Sophie found him near the car and stood beside him and looked at it, the way she looked at things she was actually trying to understand. "Does it look different now?" she said. "Finished?" "Yes," he said. "Good different or just different?" He looked at the car. The rust was gone from the panels that had been treated, but it wasn't gone from all of them. They'd made deliberate decisions about what to preserve and what to address, and the result was a car that showed its history without being consumed by it. It was not beautiful in the way a concours restoration was beautiful. Showroom perfect, every surface identical to some imagined factory original. It was beautiful in the way a thing that had actually lived was beautiful, worn in the right places, honest about where it had been. "Good different," he said. Sophie nodded. She thought for a moment, looking at the car, and then she said, "Do you think it knows its home?" He remembered asking himself something like that in the carriage house 2 years ago. 2 years. He remembered thinking about the original owner and the builder, and all the hands the car had passed through, and all the distance it had traveled to arrive in a corner under a tarp in Westfield, and then further, into his hands, into this room. He thought about what it meant for a thing to be known, to be seen for what it actually was by someone with the knowledge to see it, whether that was a kind of homecoming. "I think it knows what it is again," he said, "which is maybe the same thing." Sophie considered this and seemed to find it satisfactory. She leaned slightly against his arm, the casual, unself-conscious lean of a child who wasn't thinking about the gesture, and they stood together in the gallery and looked at the car in its proper light, and the evening went on around them, and somewhere outside the October air was doing what it did, and the day moved toward its close in the ordinary way days did, indifferent to significance, requiring nothing in particular, just continuing. Later, driving home on the familiar highway with Sophie asleep in the passenger seat and the Boston skyline receding in the rearview mirror, Ethan drove in the comfortable silence of a man who had finished something, not the silence of emptiness. He already knew the paper wasn't done, and Danny had texted that the Camry was back with a new noise, and there was a woman from the Michigan University who wanted to talk about the symposium. The work was not over. The work was never over. That was, he had come to understand, the best thing about it. He drove home to Millbrook in the October dark and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The way you thought when you were tired and satisfied and the road was familiar and the night was clear and the person you loved most in the world was asleep beside you, trusting you with the driving, which was a kind of trust so ordinary it was easy to forget how much it meant. He didn't forget. He drove home, and the town was quiet when he arrived, and he carried Sophie inside and put her to bed without waking her, and he stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark the way he always had. And then he turned off the hall light and went to the kitchen and sat at the table with a glass of water and the quiet house around him. The keys were still in the dish by the front door. 3 old keys on a worn leather fob. He'd never moved them. He didn't entirely know why. Habit, maybe, or something less easily named. They had been there since the night he'd come home from the gala and laid them on the table and sat down to think. And they had stayed through all of it, through the investigation and the authentication and the press and the negotiations and the restoration and the unveiling and all the ordinary days between, and they were still there. He looked at them from across the kitchen. Then he got up and went to bed.